Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 561 through 570 of the previous episode. Share is the 600-character summary of the story focusing on Qian Ping'an. While traveling with his companions, Qian Ping'an meets Zhang Yun, a powerful cultivator possessing the dragon-binding chain Fated Opportunity, who warns him about the dangerous culture of Wasp Tail Ferry Station. Later, Qian Ping'an and his group discover an innately gentle Dragon Gate tier Earth Bull being relentlessly hunted by a greedy pack of vagrant cultivators, led by a golden core Earth Immortal. Refusing to let the mountain veins fracture and cause an earthquake that would devastate innocent mortals, Qian Ping'an steps in to protect the demon, buying its freedom by throwing 50 lesser heat coins to the aggressive cultivators. As they journey toward the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation on foot, Qian Ping'an patiently uses the opportunity to educate his exceptionally talented opening disciple, Pei Qian, on the vital importance of moral vigilance, reason, and adhering to proper etiquette. Seeking refuge from an abnormal energy-infused torrential rainstorm, they encounter the Great Marsh Gang and Blusher Hall inside a mountain cave. Qian Ping'an skillfully uses a Yang Energy Illumination Talisman and calm reasoning to defuse a hostile confrontation between the two cultivation factions. After the storm subsides, they are invited by the local Taoist priests to ascend Azure Waste Mountain and visit the Golden Osmanthus Temple, continuing their journey together. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 571. Su Yuanxia was rather delighted with the decision to visit the Golden Osmanthus Temple. After all, this temple was closed to the public all year round, meaning that outsiders were unable to visit and experience its impressive nature. There were rumors in the Azure Phoenix Nation claiming that the rain of osmanthus flowers in White Water Temple had actually originated from the ancient trees located at the back of the Golden Osmanthus Temple, all of which were thousands of years old. An immortal traveling around the world had also visited the temple and pointed at the osmanthus trees, saying that these were osmanthus trees from the moon. 1. The yellow earth bull hadn't entered the rock cave to seek shelter with the group, and this was because it was a demon. In other words, it was possible that the cultivators from the temple might suspect it of being involved in this incident. If that happened, then Qian Ping'an would be forced to explain many things to alleviate the suspicions and worries of the Golden Osmanthus Temple. Fortunately, the earth bull was well aware of how things worked with cultivators from the mountains. Laying in the mountain forest far away from the stone cave, it used its mind's voice to inform Qian Ping'an that it would burrow into the ground at the foot of the mountain and wait for them there. Unless an earth immortal scoured the area, it was very unlikely that anyone would detect its presence. Qian Ping'an told the earth bull to be careful, and to run up Azure Waste Mountain if it encountered any trouble. Qian Ping'an would naturally step forward to explain the situation. The Golden Osmanthus Temple was located at the top of Azure Waste Mountain, and the muddy mountain path made it especially difficult to reach it. From the foot of the mountain to the temple at the peak, the widest section of the mountain path could only accommodate 3 people walking side by side. Thus, one didn't need to dream about going up the mountain in a horse-drawn carriage. Judging from this, it was very clear that the Golden Osmanthus Temple was indeed quite unwilling to interact with the outside world. When visiting the Green Goat Palace atop Clear Realm Mountain, Qian Ping'an and the others had needed to climb the cinnabar staircase of more than 3,000 steps. This staircase was even more magnificent and majestic than the staircases decorated with cloud dragon engravings in the imperial palaces. The Golden Osmanthus Temple wasn't large, and it could only accommodate 40 to 50 Taoist priests. While climbing Azure Waste Mountain with their juniors and descendants, the various groups of people from the cultivation world had hired people to build simple thatched cottages at the waist of the mountain so that they could rest there. The Golden Osmanthus Temple didn't stop this. Upon seeing how easygoing the temple was, some observant people from the cultivation forces of the Azure Phoenix Nation decided to hire several dozen strong young men to directly build proper dwellings at the waist of the mountain. Moreover, these dwellings were no inferior to the inns found on the busy streets and alleys of bustling cities. The Golden Osmanthus Temple was a relatively uncommon type of temple found in the mountain forests. According to what the handsome Taoist priest revealed during their casual conversation, the assets of the temple didn't fully belong to the branch of Taoism that they belonged to. Moreover, apart from the Taoist priests who were temporarily staying in the Golden Osmanthus Temple to cultivate, Those who became disciples of Temple Master Zhonggua would also receive formal recognition from the imperial court of the Azure Phoenix Nation later. They would become official immortals. In fact, this was probably the fundamental reason so many powerful forces and wealthy clans from the cultivation world were willing to rush over to Azure Waste Mountain with their juniors and descendants. Only the larger Taoist temples would have all of the relevant positions filled, with 3 overseers, 5 masters, and 18 heads. However, there were only 40 to 50 Taoist priests in the Golden Osmanthus Temple, so there was naturally no need to be so stringent and fill all of these positions. Apart from Temple Master Zhonggua, there were only 2 or 3 supervisors and a similar number of bookkeepers in the temple. The handsome priest was called Su Borui, and he was in charge of the drum in the Golden Osmanthus Temple. Even though the temple was small, the drum and the bell naturally couldn't be neglected. Temple Master Zhonggua was going to choose his disciples in 2 days. As one of the largest and most powerful forces in the Azure Phoenix Nation, Zhu Fengxian's Great Marsh Gang had spent a large sum of money, more than 100,000 taels of silver, to construct a so-called summer palace at the waist of the mountain. This summer palace was extremely eye-catching even among the many other structures. By the looks of it, Zhu Fengxian was absolutely confident that his granddaughter would be chosen as a disciple of the temple master. Blusher Hall had also hired workers to construct a unique garden villa. However, Taoist priest Su Borui directly turned to the 2 young girls and said, "Lu Qingcheng Zhu Xiang, the 2 of you can follow me to the temple. The Golden Osmanthus Temple has already prepared 2 rooms for you." After saying this, Su Borui turned to Chen Ping'an and said with a smile, "The temple is small and simple, so apologies for our lack of hospitality. We only have 2 rooms remaining, but you can follow me up the mountain if you're willing to stay in a room by yourself. If you're unwilling to split up with your friends but have nowhere else to go either, then I can personally contact some acquaintances in the Azure Phoenix Nation and get a place for you to stay for a few days. Don't worry about the hassle. It's actually a good opportunity for us to build some positive karma." Zhu Fengxian laughed heartily and remarked, "There's no need to go to so much trouble, Taoist Su. This young master and his companions can stay with my group." The old woman from Blusher Hall naturally wanted to invite Chen Ping'an and his companions as well. However, it was a pity that they were all female, so it was necessary for them to avoid arousing suspicion of illicit relationships. Unable to say anything, they could only watch on as this huge fated opportunity was snatched away by the brutish martial artists from the Great Marsh Gang. The heavy downpour finally stopped, and Chen Ping'an asked Su Borui whether he could go up the mountain to take a look at the osmanthus trees in the temple today. Su Borui smiled and said that there was no problem at all. However, he would need to accompany Chen Ping'an, as visitors weren't allowed to wander around by themselves in the Golden Osmanthus Temple. And thus, Chen Ping'an brought Pei Qian, Zhang Shanfeng, and Su Yuanxia with him as he continued to climb the mountain. Meanwhile, Wei Xian and the others returned to the so-called Summer Palace with old demon Zhu Fengxian from the Azure Phoenix Nation. Holding a large bundle of oil paper umbrellas in his arms, the little Taoist priest was hanging around Pei Qian and talking to her, and he seemed to be having the fun time of his life. This was inevitable. He was the youngest member of the temple, and everyone else was an ancient relic who barely had any teeth remaining. And if they weren't, then they were strict and serious junior uncles like Su Borui. Now that the little Taoist priest had finally come across someone the same age as him, he was naturally as delighted as could be. However, Pei Qian was starting to feel a little annoyed. How had she ended up with such a chatterbox sticking to her? Shouldn't cultivators in the mountains all appear blind, deaf, and mute? Blusher Hall's Lu Qingcheng and Zhu Fengxian's granddaughter Zhu Xiang left the protection of their seniors to go to the Golden Osmanthus Temple with Taoist priest Su Borui. The former was slightly timid, while the latter appeared completely fearless, continuing to confirm the veracity of some rumors about the temple with Taoist priest Su Borui. Su Borui was most likely a transcendent individual with a gentle nature, and he patiently answered all of Zhu Xiang's questions without adding any embellishments. He didn't conceal anything either. Thus, Zhu Xiang immediately developed a good impression of this Taoist priest as well as the Golden Osmanthus Temple. Lu Qingcheng summoned her courage and asked the round-faced young girl from the Great Marsh Gang in a quiet voice, "Oh, so your name isn't actually Knight?" Zhu Xiang slapped her forehead and remarked, "How can there be someone as naive as you in the cultivation world? In fact, Zhu Xiang was already showing some mercy by not directly calling Lu Qingcheng stupid. Zhu Xiang glanced at the exquisite paper-cutting knife hanging by Lu Qingcheng's waist out of the corners of her eyes. The bamboo scabbard was inscribed with the characters miniature one. And Zhu Xiang asked with a smile, "Your paper-cutting knife looks fairly nice. Care to give me a look?" Lu Qingcheng shook her head and replied in a timid voice, "This is an heirloom left behind by my great ancestor, so I can't give it to other people carelessly." Zhu Xiang wanted to continue nagging Lu Qingcheng, but Su Borui smiled faintly and said, "Zhu Xiang, you shouldn't force people against their will. You need to keep this in mind if you become fellow disciples who cultivate together in the future." Zhu Xiang had a fairly good impression of the handsome Taoist priest, who was one of Temple Master Zhu Xiang's direct disciples. In fact, he might become her senior brother in the Golden Osmanthus Temple very soon. Because of this, she decided to spare the timid young girl from Blusher Hall. Lu Qingcheng looked at Su Borui in gratitude, and the latter simply responded with a smile. Chen Ping'an looked at the two young girls who were about to become cultivators in the mountains. This reminded him of his encounter in the colorful garment nation. Back then, a young girl with bells on her wrists and ankles had once fought alongside Chen Ping'an, subduing demons and eliminating fiends together. Even though her cultivation base as a qi refiner hadn't been especially high, she hadn't made the situation more difficult for Chen Ping'an either. She was a very chivalrous young girl, and she had ended up becoming a disciple of the Divine Edict sect, something that people were extremely envious of. In addition to her, there were also the two children whom he had first encountered in the firewood shed. They had experienced many challenges, but they could probably be considered semi-cultivators as well now. Fortune and misfortune appeared to exist on two extremes, yet it was often the case that they were only separated by a few simple actions. After arriving at the Golden Osmanthus Temple, the two fortunate young girls were led to their rooms by a Taoist priest. Meanwhile, the little Taoist priest followed his senior brother to put the Osmanthus branch oil paper umbrellas away. These umbrellas were incredibly precious, and according to Junior Uncle Su, a single umbrella could sell for thousands of taels of silver if the temple were willing to sell them. Considering the osmanthus branches they were made of, this was only natural. The little Taoist priest couldn't help but have his mind wander. If a single umbrella with an osmanthus branch were worth this much money, then just how much would the 6 ancient osmanthus trees be worth? If they sold the trees, wouldn't Azure Waste Mountain be renamed Gold and Silver Mountain? Su Borui led Chen Ping'an and his companions through the small and tranquil Taoist temple. They headed straight to the back of the temple, and their vision was wide and unobscured now that the rain had cleared up. They could already see the lush leaves of those ancient and towering osmanthus trees, with the middle tree appearing especially tall. Each osmanthus tree had its own name, and Su Borui introduced them one by one, also explaining what mystical comments some paramount immortals from the mountains had made about them in the past. His explanations were simple and concise, yet he managed to keep them very interesting. There were crisscrossing paths paved with blue stone slabs between the ancient osmanthus trees, and there were also stone tables and stools under their shade. The stone table located under the ancestral osmanthus tree also had a go board engraved on its surface. Su Borui paused here for a moment, and he ran his finger over the go board as he smiled and explained that this go board wasn't engraved using a chisel. Rather, a traveling sword immortal had exhaled a breath of razor-sharp sword qi and used it to measure up the stone table. Afterward, the Taoist priests had used a very precise ruler to measure the go board, and they had discovered that the vertical and horizontal lines weren't off by even a hair. In other words, this implied that the sword immortal had at least been a golden core tier cultivator. In fact, it was even possible that he was a hidden nascent tier sword immortal from the eastern treasured Vile continent. Su Borui was in high spirits as he explained this, and he continued with a faint smile. A long time ago, a certain senior from the Taoist temple insisted on getting to the bottom of this. He traveled tens of thousands of kilometers, and he specially visited Wind Snow Temple, True Martial Mountain, Sun Scorch Mountain, and Wind Lightning Field to search for that sword immortal. He visited many renowned sword cultivators during this trip, and in the end, he concluded that the sword immortal who had made the engraving was very likely Tuanjing, Great Sword Immortal Li, the paramount nascent tier cultivator from Wind Lightning Field. However, It was a shame that this senior no longer had the time or power to revisit Wind Lightning Field to confirm this after returning to the temple. And for the hundreds of years afterward, this became an unsolved mystery. I once witnessed Wind Lightning Field's sect leader Li unleashing a sword strike through an immortal picture scroll on an intercontinental ship, Qian Ping'an remarked. It was extremely impressive. It's a shame that sect leader Li seems to have passed away after resolving Wind Lightning Field's conflict with Sunscorch Mountain. I wonder if Wind Lightning Field can find his reincarnation and bring it back to the sect so it can embark on the journey of cultivation again, maintaining the karmic fate between them. Su Borui was astonished and he exclaimed, "Great Sword Immortal Li has passed away?" By the looks of it, the Golden Osmanthus Temple had genuinely been secluded from the world for the past 100 years. Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "This is what I heard. However, with how profoundly powerful Great Sword Immortal Li was, I don't dare to guarantee that it's true. Perhaps he's searching for an opportunity to break through to the unpolished jade tier." Wind Lightning Field's Lu Baqiao could be regarded as one of Qian Ping'an's few friends from the mountains. For the sake of celestial maiden Su Jia, Lu Baqiao had once stood atop a flying sword and pursued the intercontinental ship that Qian Ping'an was on. That had led to a reunion between them. Thus, Qian Ping'an was fully aware that Li Tuanjing had genuinely passed away. However, as Lu Baqiao's good friend, he naturally couldn't appear too confident regarding these extremely important matters when he was speaking with outsiders. He couldn't flaunt this insider knowledge to other people. However, Qian Ping'an was someone who paid close attention to details, so he immediately noticed the subtle change in Su Borui's expression after he mentioned the unpolished jade tier. Qian Ping'an realized at this moment that not all qi refiners were aware of the names of the upper 5 tiers. In fact, many people would simply gaze up at the title of Earth Immortal for their entire lives. This was similar to how Zhu He had been certain that the Mountain Summit tier was the 9th and final tier of martial arts. He was certain that it was impossible to advance any further. With Qian Ping'an's current mental state, however, he no longer cared too much about these trivial and harmless mistakes. When traveling through the cultivation world and interacting with pure martial artists, and when climbing the mountains to enjoy the scenery and interact with qi refiners, it wasn't necessarily a good idea to only take but not give. Indeed, revealing some secrets could perhaps prevent many troubles in the long run. Qian Ping'an's tour of the Golden Osmanthus Temple came to an end after he saw the ancient osmanthus trees located near the back of the temple. Su Borui led Qian Ping'an and his companions to the entrance of the temple again, and he sincerely invited them to attend the disciple recruiting ceremony that was going to take place in 2 days. He also offered to organize seats for Qian Ping'an and his companions. Qian Ping'an expressed his thanks before leaving and heading back to the waist of the mountain. After walking 100 or so paces, Su Yuanxia glanced back at Su Borui, who was yet to turn around and return inside the temple. He was still standing there and watching them depart. Su Yuanxia turned back around and said with a soft chuckle, "Taoist priest Su is an intelligent person. He'll definitely do well in the Golden Osmanthus Temple." Qian Ping'an nodded and concurred. Immortal clans and forces in the mountains all need someone who's intelligent and able to remain flawless when hosting guests and attending to matters. Zhang Shanfeng felt a tinge of sadness. It was clear that he was thinking of the Taoist temple that he was from. After traveling around the world for so many years, it was inevitable that he missed his master, even including his bulbous nose and thunderous snores. If it weren't for his chance encounters with Qian Ping'an and Su Yuanxia, it was very likely that this external heavenly master who didn't carry the Zhang surname and was yet to become an official Taoist priest would have dejectedly returned to the northern complete reed continent a long time ago. After Qian Ping'an and his companions arrived at the extravagant residence constructed by the Great Marsh Gang, they found that an astute and capable steward had already been waiting for them at the entrance for a long time. The steward turned and bowed slightly before leading Qian Ping'an and the others inside the residence. After Qian Ping'an and the others all settled down, Su Borui respectfully stood inside the courtyard of a tranquil and refined residence located even deeper within the Golden Osmanthus Temple than the ancient osmanthus trees. There were also 2 esteemed guests who had offered their help in a chivalrous manner and suppressed the sinister beings with ill intentions. In reality, both of them had interacted with Qian Ping'an before, whether directly or indirectly. One was Zhang Yun, the burly young man, and the other was Wei Liang, a chief military governor of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Right now, the three of them were sitting around a table and eating a bowl of vegetarian noodles each. There were spring bamboo shoots, mountain mushrooms, several types of wild vegetables that grew in the mountain during spring, fried gluten balls, and slow-cooked soup. The fragrance of the vegetarian noodles wafted through the air. After Su Borui roughly explained his impression of Changpingen and his companions to the three people, Temple Master Zhonggua smiled and told his disciple to take his leave and have a rest. The old temple master then asked, "Is this a coincidence, or have they followed the traces and found their way here?" Wei Liang pondered for a moment before replying, "It should be a coincidence. If it weren't for Su Borui, these people would have run over to block the entrance of my governor's office already." He then turned to Jiang Yun and asked, "Judging by the change in your expression just then, perhaps you're familiar with this person as well?" Jiang Yun nodded and explained, "He's a native from the Jewel Small World, and he was still an ordinary commoner the first time I saw him. However, he's gone through significant changes these past few years, and I was almost unable to recognize him when I saw him again. He's a fairly decent person, but I hazard a guess that he's caught up in many different matters. I didn't dare to speak with him too much when I came across him at Wasp Tail Ferry Station a while ago." Wei Liang smiled and remarked, "Since he's a native from the Jewel Small World, then all of the strange matters pertaining to him aren't so strange anymore." Jiang Yun didn't have any objections to this statement. Even though he had entered the Jewel Small World with a bag of gold essence copper coins to search for opportunities, the number of fated opportunities that he could obtain was still incomparable to some certain locals who had simply stayed put and waited for fortunes to descend upon them. Even so, he could be counted as one of the more fortunate outsiders, especially since he had obtained the dragon binding chain and refined it into his bonded item. This was a huge and unexpected surprise, and even his powerful master was quite astonished and delighted. His master had smiled and speculated that he had perhaps snatched away a significant portion of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan's good fortune, and that was what had allowed him to obtain this huge fated opportunity. Jiang Yun had immediately taken a liking to the iron chain hanging from the iron lockwell in the Jewel Small World back then, and his master asked a friend to appraise the iron chain for Jiang Yun after he managed to obtain it. The conclusion was that the iron chain was a precious relic left behind by a powerful cultivator, who was at least at the immortal tier. Moreover, it could already be regarded as a genuine pseudo-celestial tool, even before all of the secret restrictions were removed. It was rumored that the highest-grade dragon-binding chains were actually called dragon-slaying chains, and they're might more profound than that of Dragon King baskets, which were used to restrict and capture ancient Earth immortal flood dragons. Powerful cultivators could easily bind and restrict flood dragons with a simple toss of these chains. With a casual shake of the chain, they could then directly flay the flood dragon and sever their tendons on the spot, leaving only their spine and dragon pearl. However, the most profound fated opportunities from the Jewel Small World were not these inanimate objects, but actually 5 small creatures. Of course, it wasn't the case that simply digging 3 feet into the ground in enough places would allow one to find one of those 5 small creatures. It was up to fate whether one could encounter and obtain those incredible fated opportunities. For example, Jiang Yun had failed to come across any of the 5 creatures. Temple Master Zhonggua put down his chopsticks before patting his belly and remarking, "I've abstained from food for many years, but I made an exception in order to welcome my 2 esteemed guests. I have to say that eating a hearty meal feels quite good." "Chief Military Governor Wei," he said with a wide smile, "the Golden Osmanthus Temple is providing you with significant help this time. Not only is the temple opening its doors to recruit disciples, but we purposely revealed the secret about our ancestral Osmanthus tree, and how it can be refined into a pseudo-celestial tool. This will attract many ill-intentioned individuals and allow us to encircle and suppress them, and will help the Azure Phoenix Nation kill more than a dozen cultivators from outside the nation. That being the case, is the Emperor not going to express his gratitude?" Wei Liang smiled and replied, "Express gratitude? Of course we will. Aren't I sitting here and enjoying a bowl of vegetarian noodles with you?" Zhonggua pointed at Wei Liang and said, "The ancestor of the temple wasn't wrong back then. You're an absolute miser. No wonder the ancestors told the future generations of the Golden Osmanthus Temple to minimize our contact with your office." Wei Liang still had half a bowl of vegetarian noodles remaining, yet he had already stopped eating and put his chopsticks down. The remaining noodles were taken by Jiang Yun, and Wei Liang turned a blind eye to the burly young man's actions. He looked at Temple Master Zhonggua and said, "You should be satisfied with what you have right now. The Golden Osmanthus Temple didn't have many worshippers and didn't receive many offerings during its earlier days. But who was it that invited Li Tuanjing over and had him eat vegetarian noodles in the temple? Oh, and this time as well. Did you, Zhonggua, invite the young master of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan over by yourself? Even if you personally carried a bowl of crappy vegetarian noodles over to Jiang Yun and offered it to him, would he be willing to pick up the pair of chopsticks and accept your offer?" Jiang Yun continued to gobble up the noodles, and he didn't give Wei Liang much face as he interjected. "A single pair of chopsticks is all I need. I'll eat however many bowls of vegetarian noodles come my way." Zhonggua laughed heartily upon hearing this, clearly in an exuberant mood. In his impression, descendants from the Cloud Forest Zhang clan were each more arrogant and haughty than the other. However, this young cultivator called Jiang Yun was very different. Since he was traveling with Wei Liang, and the relationship between them appeared very good, it was unlikely that he was from a small side branch of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan. This made things very interesting. Wei Liang hesitated for a moment before eventually saying, "Zhonggua, I'll need to trouble you with looking after that young girl from Blusher Hall in the future." An amused smile appeared on Zhonggua's face as he replied, "The paper-cutting knife miniature one, that the young girl is wearing by her waist. Is this what you gifted to one of Blusher Hall's previous leaders back then?" Wei Liang responded with a soft sigh. Zhonggua didn't take things any further. After all, which cultivator at the middle 5 tiers didn't have some links with the mortal world? It was just a matter of how much or how little. Looking back, these mortal links could be sturdy as heavy iron chains or transient as the fleeting clouds. The only difference was whether a cultivator felt nostalgic about these mortal links or not. People would have many feelings of gratitude or hostility in the mortal world, yet things would become far more complicated once they became immortals in the mountains. When cultivators bore grudges, these feelings would remain fresh even after 100 years. As a result, it was quite common to see some powerful clans in the region suddenly suffering calamity for no apparent reason. These calamities would often destroy entire clans and leave no survivors. When cultivators felt gratitude, the descendants of some certain mortals outside the mountains might continue to enjoy the blessings of their ancestors for more than a dozen generations. In fact, even these people would feel confused about how they were always able to overcome obstacles and escape from dangers. It was as if a large and invisible hand were blocking the winds of calamity for them. Zhu Fengxian's granddaughter, the young girl from the Great Marsh Gang, possesses the best aptitude, Zhonggua said. She's already a 3rd-tier qi refiner, and she's likely the only one who has the potential to become an Earth Immortal. Among the others, the young girl from Blusher Hall has the best potential. She can reach the Abode tier, and maybe even the Sea Observation tier if she's lucky. In other words, apart from the 2 of them, my opinion is that none of the 7 other disciples will be able to advance to the middle 5 tiers. Not necessarily, Wei Liang and Jiang Yun replied in unison. Zhonggua's eyes lit up and he exclaimed, "Who else has the potential?" Wei Liang smiled and didn't offer a response. Jiang Yun looked up, and he didn't offer an answer to this question either. Instead, he changed the topic and asked Wei Liang, "You're not going to deal with that Earth Bull? Didn't you want to capture it and take it as a subordinate since a long time ago? Didn't you want the Earth Bull to become a mount for the mountain god of the Azure Phoenix Nation's northern mountain?" Wei Liang shook his head and replied, "Forget about it. When it comes to fated opportunities, one can only go with the flow. Seizing something by force won't necessarily lead to good results. Actually, the mountain god of the northern mountain told me a long time ago that the yellow Earth Bull only looks gentle and harmless on the surface. However, it's actually an extremely ferocious demon at the Dragon Gate tier. What kind of demon that strong would be willing to be suppressed and trapped in a mountain to act as someone's mount for the rest of their life?" Zhonggua clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "It would be a mutually beneficial outcome if this demon could guard Azure Waste Mountain. If it's necessary, we can also treat each other as equals. The Golden Osmanthus Temple will regard the Earth Bull as a guest elder protecting the mountain. What do you say, Chief Military Governor Wei?" Wei Liang shook his head again, a solemn expression in his eyes as he smiled faintly and warned, "It's best that you don't provoke the young man called Chan Ping'an. After he left the jewel's small world, it's extremely likely that he became the disciple of some profoundly powerful legalist cultivator. You should be well aware of how legalist disciples like me conduct ourselves. Whether we're in the mountains or outside, in our eyes, everyone is equal. An expression of helplessness appeared on Zhang Guo's face as he lamented. I know, they're one of the 4 types of cultivators from the mountains who are the most troublesome to deal with. There are bloody sword cultivators, saber-lending cultivators from the Mahas sect, Taoist priests from the Taoist saber room, and finally the most unreasonable people like you, disciples of the legalist sect. We're unreasonable? Wei Liang asked with a smile. Zhang Guo felt slightly guilty, but he suddenly smiled and asked, You aren't? Then why don't you, Chief Military Governor Wei, go and speak reason with that earth bull? The principles of legalism revolve around people first and foremost, Wei Liang replied in a calm voice. Inside Chen Ping'an's room, Pei Qian was sitting at the table copying out a text. Next door, Zhang Shanfeng was earnestly cultivating in his own room. The young Taoist priest from the northern complete reed continent claimed to have mediocre cultivation aptitude, and it was only due to him having nowhere to go that his master had taken pity on him and reluctantly taken him as a final disciple. His cultivation journey had only confirmed his master's astute observations. Zhang Shanfeng's cultivation progress was indeed very slow, and even now, he was yet to successfully advance to the middle 5 tiers. However, Zhang Shanfeng was a resilient person, and he had never felt discouraged or given up hope. He would occasionally feel disappointed, but this disappointment stemmed from the fact that he wasn't strong enough when it came to subduing demons and eliminating fiends. In some sense, Zhang Shanfeng's mindset was identical to Chen Ping'an's. The path underfoot was for him to walk, so there wouldn't be any notions of talent or lack thereof as long as he didn't compare himself to other people. This mindset allowed him to remain extremely determined and grounded. There were many principles and theories regarding talent and aptitude, and the mystical nature of these principles and theories could all be captured by the word innate. The core abode created by each person would vary in size, and this would then determine how much spiritual energy each person could absorb. There was also the issue of spiritual energy absorption rate, and delving even deeper, there were differences in terms of the purity of the spiritual energy absorbed. Some people could only absorb spiritual energy in a pitifully small stream, while other people could absorb spiritual energy in astonishingly large waves. It was only after considering these aspects that one had the right to consider the environment inside their core abode, as well as the form of their nascent soul. Chen Ping'an frequently practiced the strange heaven and earth stance now, flipping upside down and standing on his hands. After practicing fist techniques for so long, Chen Ping'an was also able to figure out some things. For example, he could practice 3 stances of the mountain-shaking fist in unison, performing the 6-step walking meditation while assuming the heaven and earth stance. While doing this, he could also perform the sword furnace stance of standing meditation with a single hand. At the same time, he could also use the 18 stops technique. This was like a different world altogether. The only problem was that he couldn't exactly see where he was going. When walking through the desolate mountain forests, Chen Ping'an would often wander away as he walked, splitting up from his companions walking along the mountain path and falling into streams or rolling down hills. In the end, Pei Qian was the one who had come up with a dumb but useful solution, suggesting that they tie a rope to the tip of her hiking pole, and to the sword-nurturing gourd hanging by Chen Ping'an's waist. She would walk in front and keep Chen Ping'an on track. Of course, Pei Qian also needed to perform the 6-step walking meditation now. And just like that, the young man and the little girl started to walk together one in front of another. They were cultivators walking along the same path of the Great Tao, both literally and figuratively. Right now, Chen Ping'an was walking around the table on his hands. Pei Qian finished copying the texts, and she found Chen Ping'an's act of performing the heaven and earth stance and walking on his hands extremely interesting no matter how many times she looked at it. Chen Ping'an flipped around and jumped back on his feet before taking a deep breath. From Old Dragon City to Wasptail Ferry Station, and now to the Azure Phoenix Nation's Golden Osmanthus Temple, he was slowly recovering from Du Mao's strike that had pierced his abdomen. His strength was slowly climbing from the 3rd tier back to the 4th. However, he still needed to rely on walking meditation, the medicinal wine, and a lengthy period of recuperation before he could return to the peak of the 5th tier. In any case, there were both benefits and drawbacks to this. The drawback was naturally the fact that this would significantly delay his advance to the 6th tier. The benefit was that his foundation at the 5th tier would become even stronger. Julien had once half-joked that even without external treasures, Qian Pingyan could still rely on his 5th tier cultivation base as a pure martial artist to defeat him, Wei Xian, Lu Baixiang and Sui Yubian, for pure martial artists at the peak of the 6th tier. Sui Yubian had sneered in contempt, while Lu Baixiang had largely agreed with the assessment. As for the taciturn Wei Xian, he had been busy talking nonsense with Pei Qian at the time. Qian Pingyan sat down next to the table and checked the text that Pei Qian had copied. After confirming that she hadn't slacked off on any character, he signaled that she could head off to play. A thought occurred to Qian Pingyan and he replied, "You shouldn't talk about other people behind their backs." "Oh, okay," Pei Qian said. However, Qian Pingyan suddenly chuckled to himself and added, "That said, I feel like you're not wrong." A brilliant smile spread across Pei Qian's face and she beamed, "I knew it. So Master feels the same way too." Qian Pingyan's expression became stern as he warned her. "And that's why you need to show more respect the next time we meet Aunt Gui." Pei Qian nodded and replied, "Of course, I genuinely like Aunt Gui." "Then what about the little Taoist priest from the Golden Osmanthus Temple, who lent you an umbrella?" Qian Pingyan asked in amusement. Pei Qian slammed the table with her fist and fumed. "He was super annoying. If we encounter each other on a narrow path where there's no one else present, I'll definitely bash him up until even his parents and master can't recognize him anymore." "Oh, so you're also aware that he was annoying?" Qian Pingyan asked with a chuckle. "Then think about this. How do you always pester Wei Xian and Lu Baixiang?" Pei Qian widened her eyes in astonishment. After mulling over this for a long time, she could only retrieve her beloved treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman and slap it on her forehead. She sighed and conceded, "By the looks of it, Old Man Wei and Little Bai are quite pitiful." Qian Pingyan rewarded her with a knuckle to the forehead and lectured, "So you finally realize it now? What do the books tell us? Noble people should perform self-reflection 3 times every day. So now is a good time for you to undertake a good long self-reflection." Pei Qian grabbed her head and suddenly stood up, running to the door before turning around and chuckling. "Master, I'm going to pay Old Man Wei and Little Bai a visit now. I'll tell them that I'll pay out of my own pocket and buy them each a skewer of tonghulu the next time we go to the market." After Pei Qian left, Qian Pingyan started to think about the second bonded item that he needed to refine. As for the physical body of Du Maoxiang's soul, which was equivalent to the body of an immortal tier cultivator, Qian Pingyan decided to ask Cui Dongshan for some suggestions when he arrived at the Mountain Cliff Academy. Cui Dongshan was extremely knowledgeable about these things, so Qian Pingyan would make his decision after getting his input. Qian Pingyan genuinely didn't trust the young imperial preceptor's character, but he did trust the knowledge and experience of this person who had once been the scholarly sage's first disciple. Now that Qian Pingyan had reunited with Zhang Shanfeng, he had asked him many questions about cultivation, especially regarding the process of refining bonded items. Zhang Shanfeng naturally told Qian Pingyan everything that he knew. Even though Zhang Shanfeng's cultivation base wasn't high, his knowledge and understanding were actually quite exceptional. This was most likely due to the fact that he had come from a proper immortal force. After all, his master was an external heavenly master of Mount Longhu, who didn't carry the Zhang surname. Even though there were huge variations in the cultivation bases of external heavenly masters, Taoist priests who could record their names in the genealogical records of the heavenly master residents were all very impressive people. Qian Pingyan retrieved a pot of osmanthus wine, took out a cup, and started drinking by himself. According to Zhang Shanfeng's explanations, having more bonded items would not necessarily be better, even if one was wealthy and fortunate enough to have as many as they wanted. Being able to collect and refine one item for each of the 5 elements was the optimal outcome. There should be a bonded item similar to that of the yellow earth bull, one that would help one rapidly absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. This was essential. In addition to this, one also needed a bonded item used for fighting and offensive abilities. For example, the bonded flying swords of sword cultivators were the pinnacle of offensive bonded items. One also needed a bonded item used for defense, which could be something similar to golden sweet wine or militarian armor pellets. One would additionally need a bonded item used for the storage of treasures and weapons, and this could be something like a pocket treasure or a minimization treasure. However, these were incredibly rare and precious items that one could only obtain through a stroke of fortune most of the time. Finally, one would need a subjugation treasure. With this subjugation treasure, one could develop an aura that would naturally frighten sinister demons and fiends. At the same time, one could also continue to accumulate yang energy, allowing them to remain unharmed, even if they ventured through dangerous and unpredictable lands filled with yin energy and murderous aura. Zhang Shanfeng also told Chen Ping'an that refining bonded items was a double-edged sword. This was because the destruction of a bonded item would detrimentally affect the foundation of one's great Tao. The consequences were unthinkable. Moreover, each bonded item needed to reside in an acupoint, so if there were inferior items or items that didn't align with the flow of spiritual energy in one's body, there was a big risk of the bonded items clashing with each other, and thus detrimentally affecting the user's cultivation. In fact, one might even experience cultivation deviation because of this. In the end, Zhang Shanfeng said that collecting and refining bonded items of the 5 elements was the dream of all qi refiners except for sword cultivators. However, there was no point in directly searching for such items, because that would imply spending an exorbitant amount of immortal currency. And even then, one would still need to rely on their fated opportunities. Generally speaking, it was sufficient to have 3 decent quality bonded items, one for offense, one for defense, and one for absorbing and accumulating spiritual energy. This was the goal of most middle 5-tier qi refiners in the world, and only those who became earth immortals would aim for more. Chen Ping'an was slightly hesitant about whether he should refine the golden scholarly core given to him by city god Shun when in the prefectural city of the colorful garment nation. In any case, inside that azure wooden box was a colorful garment nation blusher prefecture city god protection seal rumored to have been personally crafted by a great heavenly master from Mount Longhu. Chen Ping'an decided that he would give this to Zhang Shanfeng as a farewell gift. City god Shun One from Blusher Prefecture had viewed this seal with great importance, so Chen Ping'an speculated that it was very possibly a pseudo-celestial tool. After all, Shunwen had personally said that this seal would possess astounding might when paired with the 5 lightning righteous technique of Mount Longhu. Back then, the seal had managed to block the infiltration of murderous aura from the large unmarked graveyard outside the prefectural city of Blusher Prefecture, even though it had been sealed inside the city god pavilion. This was a clear reflection of just how profoundly powerful it was. It was definitely no ordinary immortal treasure. Until today, Chen Ping'an hadn't opened the azure wooden box a single time. Anyhow, the reason why Chen Ping'an was hesitating about whether he should refine the golden scholarly core was that he had obtained a white bowl decorated with the paintings of the 5 mountains of the ancient Elm Nation during a battle in the colorful garment nation. Because of Su Yuanxia's suggestions, Chen Ping'an ultimately hadn't sold this bowl in the Green Beetle shop. In addition, this bowl could also produce 5 colored state soil identical to the soil in the ancient Elm Nation. Thus, Chen Ping'an naturally wouldn't use this white bowl, which could generate a profit of 5 snowflake coins a year, as his earth element bonded item. Chen Ping'an also considered the southward expedition of the Great Li Empire's mounted troops, which was easily slicing through the enemy nations right now. In the north of the Great Li Empire was Wei Bo, the formal mountain god of Cloud Drape Mountain, the northern mountain of the empire. In the south of the Great Li Empire, Fan Junmao was seemingly guarding the empire's new southern mountain. Once the Great Li Empire successfully conquered the entire eastern treasured Vile continent, the 5-colored soil of the empire would naturally become incredibly valuable. At that time, the imperial court of the Great Li Empire would definitely become extremely strict with their control of 5-colored soil as well. Thus, if Chen Ping'an could determine the choices for the 3 other mountains of the 5 mountains right now and collect enough 5-colored soil as well as a suitable storage vessel, then he could definitely reap huge benefits in the future. However, it was difficult for Chen Ping'an to determine the 3 other mountains that would be chosen as the Eastern Mountain, Western Mountain, and Central Mountain. Meanwhile, it would also be rather risky for him to use this 5-colored soil as a bonded item. It would definitely give him huge benefits in the short term, but his fate would end up being intimately linked with the rise and fall of the Great Li Empire in the long term. Even so, this would still be much more beneficial than detrimental to Chen Ping'an while he was still below the upper 5 tiers. It could accelerate his cultivation speed, and allow him to become an earth immortal very quickly. As he drank osmanthus wine, Qian Ping'an recalled the group of reconnaissance cavalry from the Great Li Empire that he had come across in the heavy wind and snow. He also recalled Song Jisun, his former neighbor. After drinking the last sip of osmanthus wine, Qian Ping'an ultimately decided against refining the 5-colored state soil as his bonded item. Having made this decision, Qian Ping'an didn't hesitate any longer. He was going to refine the golden scholarly core as his bonded item. However, trying to gain such opportune time, geographical advantage, and support as he had in Old Dragon City would be as difficult as ascending the heavens. Qian Ping'an stood up and walked over to the window, becoming lost in thought as he rested his arms on the windowsill. At the end of the day, refining bonded items wasn't like practicing fist techniques, where perseverance would allow him to throw punch after punch, and eventually succeed in throwing 1,000,000 punches. Su Yuanxia knocked on his door and entered, after which Qian Ping'an returned to his seat beside the table and retrieved 2 wine cups. The two of them drank as they talked. They didn't discuss anything important. Su Yuanxia expressed his hope that some bookstore would one day be willing to publish and sell his travel journal. That way he could earn some money for himself. Upon hearing this, Qian Ping'an retrieved several bamboo slips on which he had recorded the interesting things that he had seen or heard on his journey. There were Old Dragon City's colossal immortal intercontinental ships such as Osmanthus Island and the Mountain and Sea Turtle, the Sea of Clouds above Old Dragon City, the rain god statues of that sect located on the island in the sea, the rain-bringing old flood dragon that had plummeted into the sea in exhaustion near the flood dragon trench, the paintings of numerous sword immortals in stalactite mountains Ganoderma Inn, the carriageway at the Sword Chi Great Wall, Sky Calling Street Inn, the Parasol Leaf Continent's Planchette Writing Sect, the sunset at Screen Illuminating Peak outside Mirage City. Qian Ping'an handed these lush green bamboo slips that were filled with a dense array of characters to Su Yuanxia. The big-bearded martial artist asked about the details, and the two of them continued to drink as one asked questions and one provided answers. Time slowly flowed away with the wine. Next door, the young Taoist priest had completed his session of meditation and breathing exercises and was starting to slowly throw punches. However, his punches were very different from most fist techniques in the world, and he was seeking to punch slowly rather than to punch quickly. This kind of fist technique was unsuitable for fighting enemies, and it could probably only be used to nurture one's body. However, Zhang Shanfeng felt like it was most suitable for his friend. He had created this fist technique by himself, so it was still only in its infancy stages right now. The principles behind this fist technique had come from his master's drunken words as well as his own comprehension, so he didn't know whether Qian Ping'an would like it or not. Would Qian Ping'an be willing to learn and practice this fist technique? It was evening in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and 2 Confucian scholars from afar, dressed in azure, sat at a small and greasy table of a stall located by the road. There was a bamboo container filled with bamboo chopsticks on the table. The skinny Confucian scholar who was around 30 years old was familiar with his companion's temper, so he said in a solemn voice, "Zhou Yuran, let me say this first. I can't eat spicy food." The young Confucian scholar called Zhou Yuran smiled and replied, "Monkey, you've missed many delicacies in the world simply because you don't eat spicy food." The senior scholar who had been teasingly called Monkey shook his head in helplessness. He had been frightened and apprehensive the entire time while traveling over here. This was inevitable. Zhou Yuran was a complete troublemaker whose idea of right and wrong was far more fuzzy than that of any virtuous scholar in any Confucian academy. However, he could largely accept most of Zhou Yuran's viewpoints. He looked at his surroundings, pondering. The emperor of the Azure Phoenix Nation was acting of his own will, and surprisingly allowing the winner of the debate between Buddhism and Taoism to become the new religion of the nation, placing them even higher than Confucianism. If it weren't for Lakeview Academy's attention being drawn by the Taoist Heavenly Lord in the complete Reed continent and rendering the Academy unable to deal with the matters here, it wouldn't have been him, Ho Zheng, and Zhou Yuran traveling to the Azure Phoenix Nation to address the issue. Rather than a noble scholar and a virtuous scholar coming here and wandering around the nation, it would have been 2 scholars directly heading to the imperial palace to scold the emperor. Virtuous scholar Zhou Yuran ordered 2 local specialties, asking for 1 extra spicy and 1 not spicy. He started to eat with Monkey, Ho Zheng from Old Dragon City. 1. Zhou Yuran was a young virtuous scholar who liked to call himself Zhou Ju in front of other people, and he stuffed a mass of spicy noodles into his mouth before mumbling in a muffled voice. I heard Master say that this debate between Buddhism and Taoism in the Azure Phoenix Nation is going to be pretty different from what it appears on the surface. To outsiders, this looks like a debate where the Buddhists will send 10 eminent monks and the Taoists will send 10 spiritual masters to argue with each other in the palace. It looks like a competition of who can argue better. In reality, however, the decisive factor will be hidden away from view. The imperial palace specially invited an elder from the Cloud Forest Jiang clan to act as the main referee. In addition to this, they've also asked 2 earth immortals to observe the mountains and rivers through their palms, using this mystical ability to keep an eye on a Taoist priest and a monk the entire time. They want to seamlessly organize a private debate between the 2 people to see whether Buddhism or Taoism is more profound. They want to determine a victor not only in terms of Buddhist scriptures and Taoist scriptures, but also in terms of who is better at interacting with others and persuading people. This entails comparisons between their knowledge, self-cultivation, and teaching abilities. In other words, there are 3 matches between them. Ho Zheng frowned upon hearing this. This was the first time he had heard Zhou Yuran mention this secret information. After pondering for a moment, he unfurrowed his brow and commented, "No wonder the Mountain Master didn't get very angry. They're the power of someone else to attack the enemy. In fact, the Azure Phoenix Nation's decision to do this isn't all bad." Zhou Yuran smiled knowingly and used his chopsticks to point at his interlocutor, saying, "Ho Zheng, this is the part of you that I like the most. You're open-minded, and you can also identify the positives." Noble scholar Ho Zheng shook his head and didn't say anything. Such significant events took place in Old Dragon City. "So aren't you going to return home to take a look?" Zhou Yuran asked. Ho Zheng shook his head again, replying, "Me returning home won't change anything. The clan culture passed down by the ancestors of the Ho clan was in tatters already, and what's remaining of it is already on its last legs as well. If I return, I would merely be making the flickering flames of the candle burn a little brighter. Rather than doing this, I may as well let it flicker between life and death by itself. I can only hope that a responsible descendant appears in the future. Only then will I dare to help." Zhou Yuran nodded and replied, "You've thought this through better than me." Ho Zheng smiled bitterly and said, "I was born and raised there, so how could I not think about it more carefully?" Zhou Yuran stopped eating and asked, "Are you full yet?" Ho Zheng glanced at the large and empty white bowl sitting in front of Zhou Yuran, and he saw that not even a single drop of soup was remaining. He ignored Zhou Yuran's question and started to eat. Zhou Yuran sighed in misery before turning around and shouting, "Shopkeeper, bring me another bowl. And remember to add a little less chili. The extra spicy option in your stall is truly spicy enough to kill someone." There were women and young girls wearing veiled hats returning from their outings, and Zhou Yuran looked at them and sighed with emotion. Beautiful women returning from their spring outings with a slight sheen of perspiration as well as a vague scent of refreshing fragrance brought back from the mountains and lakes. "Ah, this is truly beautiful." Ho Zheng completely ignored Zhou Yuran's words. "How about I involve myself in this situation too?" Zhou Yuran asked. "We may as well make this debate between Buddhism and Taoism in the Azure Phoenix Nation a small debate between the 3 teachings." Ho Zheng replied very quickly this time, not even looking up as he said in a calm voice, "That won't do." Zhou Yuran smacked the greasy table with his hand and shouted, "Shopkeeper, ignore what I said earlier. I want the extra spicy option again." Not far from where noble scholar Ho Zheng and virtuous scholar Zhou Yuran were eating spicy noodles in the capital, there was a small and relatively unknown Taoist temple. The temple master was a middle-aged priest who was completely unknown in the Azure Phoenix Nation, and if he were to be viewed as a cultivator like any other, then he was even less remarkable, since he hadn't even reached the middle 5 tiers. Moreover, this White Cloud Temple had only been there for 100 years or so, making it far younger than the established Taoist temples in the Azure Phoenix Nation that could easily have histories of thousands of years. Because of this, all of the locations with good feng shui in the capital had already been taken by the so-called senior Taoist temples a long time ago. Compared to the size of the city, the White Cloud Temple looked much like a small piece of tofu. It was also forced to neighbor a bustling market. However, there were indeed a few ancient trees planted inside the temple, and this was something that the temple could be slightly proud of. However, these ancient trees also caused huge problems for the temple. The children living in the surroundings liked to fly paper kites, but their kites would very often get stuck in the large trees of the temple. Thus, parents would often bring their sobbing children over and curse outside the temple. After venting their anger, they would barge into the temple to scold and lecture those timid little Taoist priests, instructing them to bring ladders over to climb the trees and retrieve the paper kites. Upon getting their kites back, the tears of sadness on the children's faces would quickly transform into smiles of delight. However, having delayed their proper matters because of these trivial things, the parents would often continue to curse. Many of them would inevitably mumble that these troublesome and useless old trees should be chopped down and used for firewood. When these troubles presented themselves, the haggard middle-aged temple master would walk out from the scripture library every single time. However, he would only dare to secretly stand in the distance with an anxious expression, relying on his junior brothers or disciples to face the wrath of the parents. One time, a little Taoist priest secretly snuck out of the Taoist temple to fly paper kites with the other children. However, he accidentally flew his kite into one of the trees, and he had a huge mental battle with himself before deciding that he cherished the paper kite far too much. Thus, he mustered his courage to tell the Taoist temple about this. In the end, however, he became an outlet for his master, the temple master, to vent his anger. He was almost spanked silly. However, the little Taoist priest also beamed in joy on the same day. As it turned out, a porcelain doll that he had wanted for a long time had mysteriously appeared on his bed. This allowed him to show off to the other little Taoist priests for a very long time. It was late in the evening now, and the middle-aged Taoist priest raised his head while sitting inside the small scripture library. His eyes were feeling slightly sore after reading for too long. The middle-aged Taoist priest had carefully read all of these scriptures and classics already, and just his reading notes from the past few years alone numbered more than 900,000 characters. Others cultivated to transcend above nobles and officials, to attain Tao and achieve longevity, and to break free from the shackles of heaven and earth. However, the temple master of the White Cloud Taoist temple simply cultivated for the sake of living a few years longer and reading a few more books. He wanted to read all of the scriptures and classics of the 3 teachings and the 100 schools of thought. Even though Qian Ping'an and the others were staying at the Great Marsh Gang's residence for the moment, Zhu Fengxian didn't visit Qian Ping'an and try to cotton up to him a single time. Only on the day of the disciple recruitment ceremony did Zhu Fengxian meet up with Qian Ping'an in the morning and inform him that it was time to head to the Golden Osmanthus Taoist temple together. Zhu Fengxian and Qian Ping'an walked side by side while climbing Azure Waste Mountain, and they simply chatted about the traditions and customs of the Azure Phoenix Nation. After arriving at the entrance of the Golden Osmanthus temple, Su Borui smiled and welcomed them before bringing the 2 groups of people to their seats. Zhu Fengxian's Great Marsh Gang and Qian Ping'an's group were seated next to each other. In the end, Temple Master Zhonggui took 9 disciples, with Zhu Ziang and Lu Qingcheng unsurprisingly taking up 2 of the 9 spots. Of the other 7, 2 were siblings with a commoner background and 5 were descendants of wealthy clans in the Azure Phoenix Nation, Fortune Mountain Nation, and Lofty Sky Nation. Counting Su Borui and his 2 fellow disciples, Temple Master Zhonggui now had 12 direct disciples. The little Taoist priest who had lent an umbrella to Pei Qian had now become the senior brother of 9 new disciples. Standing behind Su Borui, he was so delighted that he couldn't wipe the smile from his face. He hurriedly looked over at Pei Qian, yet he discovered that she wasn't looking at him at all. The little Taoist priest couldn't help but feel slightly disappointed. The recruitment of disciples in Taoist temples was filled with formalities. The entire process actually took almost 2 hours. Following the conclusion of the ceremony, however, the Golden Osmanthus temple gave Qian Ping'an, Zhu Fengxian, the old woman from Blusher Hall, and the leaders of the various other forces an oil paper umbrella each. Considering the value of these items, they didn't have the right to complain even if they observed formalities for 2 entire days. Zhu Fengxian needed to remain at the waist of the mountain for a few more days. Zhu Ziang had only just become a disciple of the Golden Osmanthus temple, after all, so what if she was unaccustomed to the lifestyle and failed to acclimatize quickly enough? Zhu Fengxian would feel uneasy and anxious if he left right away. Qian Ping'an had watched a disciple recruiting ceremony for free, and he had even been given a precious osmanthus branch umbrella for his trouble. After farewelling Zhu Fengxian and the old woman from Blusher Hall, Qian Ping'an and the others left Azure Waste Mountain, walking along the serene mountain path and heading to the chief military governor's office. The yellow earth bull joined the group, and Pei Qian was sitting on its back right now. When asking to ride the earth bull just then, Pei Qian had received a solid knuckle to the head from Qian Ping'an. However, the earth bull surprisingly didn't reject Pei Qian's request, and allowed the little girl to sit on its back. Compared to the four martial artists from the Lotus Flower-blessed land, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia knew much more about matters pertaining to immortals in the mountains. Thus, they were very surprised by the yellow earth bull's response. Another 10 days passed, and they walked by a village that was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. Dusk was setting in, and wisps of curling smoke rose from the chimneys of the houses with white walls and black roofs. The beams were filled with carvings and the pillars were covered in paintings, and the whole picture of the village was that of a paradise of peace and happiness. Qian Ping'an and the others walked over following the small path on the mountain ridge, and when they arrived at the village, they discovered that neither side could speak the language of the other. Finally, a teacher from the village school hurriedly walked over and communicated with Qian Ping'an using the official dialect of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, which he wasn't very fluent in. After speaking for a while, Qian Ping'an learned that almost everyone in the village coincidentally had the surname Qian. They had practiced martial arts and worked as armed escorts for generation after generation, and according to the clan rules established by their ancestors, children needed to stay in school for at least 4 years before they could leave and work in the fields, regardless of how poor their family was. The clan leader was an old man around 70 years of age. Yet even at his age, he was still filled with energy and vigor, with a spring in his step. He was dressed in a gray changshan, and according to the teacher from the village school, he was extremely skilled at martial arts and highly respected in the surrounding region of several hundred kilometers in radius. Because the clan leader had once stopped a prancing horse with his bare hands to save a little child in the busy market, people had honored him with the title of Chen's Archway. The elderly clan leader was extremely delighted upon hearing that Qian Ping'an's surname was also Qian, and he cordially invited Qian Ping'an to his house as a guest. He had already finished dinner, yet he asked his family to cook up an entire table of delicious dishes again. Meanwhile, the elderly clan leader retrieved a pot of self-made sorghum liquor, and dragged Qian Ping'an over to drink with him. Even though the elderly clan leader liked to drink, he wasn't a fan of forcing others to drink with him. However, it was exactly because of this that Qian Ping'an ended up having a little too much to drink. In the end, he had no idea how he left the dinner table and went inside a room. When he woke up halfway through the night, he finally discovered that he was lying on a large and unfamiliar bed with an antique design. He pulled aside his blanket before putting on his boots and walking outside. Gazing up, he could see the exquisitely crafted dugong of the building. 1. Back in the Lotus Flower-blessed land, Qian Ping'an had asked Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu for many construction books related to building bridges. Among these books, Qian Ping'an had read the treatise on architectural methods or state building standards quite a few times. This treatise not only explained the standards of building bridges, but also introduced the standards for building houses, pagodas, and many other building types. Qian Ping'an was enraptured by these aspects of the treatise as well. Most of the houses in the village were connected with a shared wall, leading to many of the corridors being extremely long. After splitting up their inheritances, many siblings would continue to be neighbors with each other. Qian Ping'an walked out of the long corridor and onto a small path paved with bluestone slabs, following it all the way to a pond. He then stood there for an entire night. In reality, he wasn't thinking about too many things either. Instead, he was simply standing there and zoning out. The next day, he stayed behind again, following the insistence of the elderly clan leader. Even though Pei Qian couldn't speak the local dialect, she was still able to play together with a large group of children the same age as her. When heading over to call Pei Qian back for dinner, the group of children were busy playing catch the chicks. 3. Pei Qian was just about to ask Qian Ping'an to play with them, yet Qian Ping'an smiled and raised a finger, bending it inward and pretending to strike her forehead. However, he couldn't resist Pei Qian's relentless nagging, so he eventually caved in and became the mother hen protecting the little chicks. Meanwhile, Pei Qian became the eagle hunting the little chicks. How could Pei Qian hope to catch a single chick tagging along behind Qian Ping'an, the mother hen? And thus, Pei Qian swapped positions with the chick at the end of the line. As they played, Pei Qian was the one who laughed the loudest. There was a young Taoist priest standing in the distance, and he beckoned to them with a smile, signaling that it was time for the master and disciple to return and have dinner with everyone else. It was almost time for the children to stop playing and return home as well. Smoke and steam rose from the kitchens into the colorful twilight sky, and many adults stood outside their houses and loudly called their children's names. Chen Ping'an held Pei Qian's hand and walked toward Zhang Shanfeng. Afterward, a short old Taoist priest with a bulbous nose suddenly appeared in front of the three of them as they walked along an alley. He was wearing black Taoist robes, and there was a bright red and lifelike fire dragon embroidered on each of his two sleeves. Zhang Shanfeng was completely dumbfounded. Chen Ping'an held his breath and gathered his concentration, as if he were facing a powerful enemy. Pei Qian only stole a few glances at the old Taoist priest before turning her head around, not daring to look at him anymore. Zhang Shanfeng hurriedly walked forward and asked in confusion, "Master, why have you come here?" The old Taoist priest widened his eyes and replied, "If I don't capture you and bring you back to the mountain to cultivate, then perhaps you're going to stay in the outside world, marry, have children, and start your own clan?" Zhang Shanfeng turned around and flashed a helpless smile at Chen Ping'an, most likely signaling to his friend that this was the stinky temper of his master, so he shouldn't take it to heart. When Zhang Shanfeng turned around, the old Taoist priest dazedly looked at the slightly pale face of the young Taoist priest as well as his shoulder, which had been pierced by a bonded flying sword. The old Taoist priest stomped his foot and flared up in rage, asking, "Who dared to injure you? Tell me who it was and your master. We'll stab a voodoo doll of them." Zhang Shanfeng reached up and rubbed his face. To have a master such as this. He truly had no face to look at Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an's expression was solemn as he cupped his fists and paid respect to the old Taoist priest from the northern complete reed continent. The old Taoist priest, an external heavenly master from Mount Longhu, nodded at Chen Ping'an in acknowledgement. He then used the ripples in his mind's lake to directly say, "Young lad, your bridge of immortality has been destroyed and then reconstructed? You've had a rough ride. However, your bonded item belonging to the water element is truly filled with an immortal aura. This is quite impressive." After saying this, the old Taoist priest turned his attention back to Zhang Shanfeng and asked him to hold out his hand. Holding two fingers together, the old Taoist priest drew a talisman in the air before casually flicking his sleeve and causing a burst of golden light to flash in the air. The two weapons that had been left in the chief military governor's office, Zhang Shanfeng's true martial and Su Yuanxia's short saber, immediately fell down from the sky. Zhang Shanfeng wasn't surprised at all. He reached out and caught true martial and the short saber, and he didn't forget to turn around and explain to Chen Ping'an, "My master's cultivation base isn't high, and he isn't skilled at many things. However, he's quite good at these kinds of small tricks." The old Taoist priest stroked his beard and smiled smugly, surprisingly not feeling humiliated about being exposed by his disciple. Instead, he looked quite proud of himself. Chen Ping'an glanced at the young Taoist priest before glancing at the old Taoist priest with fiery dragons embroidered on his sleeves. He felt like Zhang Shanfeng's familiarity with his master was causing some deep misunderstanding and blinding him to his master's true capabilities. Using the tip of his foot, the old Taoist priest appeared to randomly scribble on the ground for a moment. Not a single mark was left on the bluestone path. Yet the old Taoist priest instructed Zhang Shanfeng to step inside. Zhang Shanfeng wanted to speak, yet he couldn't help but hesitate. The old Taoist priest's voice was firm and unable to be questioned as he said, "I'm going to take you on a trip to Mount Longhu." Zhang Shanfeng raised his foot to step inside the talisman that seemingly didn't exist, but first tossed the short saber to Chen Ping'an and said with a bitter smile, "Help me apologize to Big Brother Su. This has come far too suddenly, so I can only leave without saying goodbye." Chen Ping'an caught Su Yuanxia's short saber and suddenly remembered something. He hurriedly retrieved the azure wooden box from his pocket treasure and tossed it to Zhang Shanfeng, saying, "Here, this is a gift for you. There's a seal from the city god pavilion of the colorful garment nation's blusher prefecture inside this box. And it's best that you use it together with the 5 lightning righteous technique." Seeing that the wooden box was old and seemingly very ordinary, Zhang Shanfeng felt at ease as he accepted it and placed it inside a pocket. The old Taoist priest suddenly squinted his eyes before returning to normal again. He smiled and said, "I'll give you 10 seconds to make a request. I won't accept any request after the time is up." Qian Pinyin didn't hesitate at all as he replied, "Then, spiritual master, can I please trouble you with earnestly teaching Zhang Shanfeng some profound Tao techniques? Can you please be a little more diligent?" The old Taoist priest laughed heartily and pointed at Qian Pinyin, clicking his tongue in wonder and remarking, "Good one, young lad, you're scolding me in a roundabout manner." He then grabbed Zhang Shanfeng, and the two of them disappeared in a flash. Qian Pinyin noticed that the sparse spiritual energy in the alley wasn't affected at all. Qian Pinyin fell deep into thought. Pei Qian tugged Qian Pinyin's sleeve and asked, "What should we do?" Qian Pinyin regained his senses and replied with a smile, "Go back and eat, of course." At the dinner table of the Qian clan's leader, Qian Pinyin sat down in Zhang Shanfeng's original spot and briefly explained the situation to Su Yuanxia, telling him that the young Taoist priest had been brought away by his master. To the big-bearded martial artist, this was nothing more than an ordinary parting. During his earlier years on the battlefield, he had become accustomed to eternal partings with his companions. Thus, even death was a common occurrence to him. How could anything less than that upset him? Qian Pinyin accompanied Su Yuanxia and drank a few cups of wine. In fact, before entering the dining room and sitting down at the table, he had already taken out 2 pots of osmanthus wine, one for the clan leader and one to enjoy with Su Yuanxia. The elderly clan leader had drunk sorghum liquor his entire life, so his impression of alcohol was that it should burn the throat and light up the belly. He was also a direct person, so he asked the village teacher sitting beside him to translate his comments for Qian Pinyin. Using the official dialect of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, the village teacher repeated the elderly clan leader's words to Qian Pinyin, saying that this wine was most likely very expensive. However, its taste was very mellow and not impactful enough, meaning that it lacked some flavor. That being the case, it would be just right for the women in the village. Qian Pinyin felt slightly helpless upon hearing this. Su Yuanxia was also well aware of just how valuable this osmanthus wine was. This was a wine that could genuinely extend the lifespan of ordinary mortals. In fact, just 1 cup of this wine was worth more than all of the sorghum liquor in this village combined. Yet, the elderly clan leader had such a low opinion of it? Su Yuanxia almost choked on his wine. After dinner, Qian Pinyin and Su Yuanxia strolled around the tranquil village. Qian Pinyin returned the short saber to Su Yuanxia, and the latter put his weapon away as he listened to Qian Pinyin describe Zhang Shanfeng's master. Su Yuanxia was slightly astonished by what he heard, and he exclaimed, "The land-shortening technique of qi refiners is actually derived from the astral steps of Taoist priests. Zhang Shanfeng is an external Taoist priest of Mount Longhu, so it isn't strange that his master is skilled at this technique. At the end of the day, this is a technique originating from the Taoist sect after all. The major thing is how far you can travel like that. The difference between traveling a few dozen meters and a few dozen kilometers is like the difference between heaven and earth. As for drawing a talisman on the ground to bring another person away, honestly, I've never even heard of such a feat before." Qian Pinyin sighed with emotion and replied, "How should I know?" Su Yuanxia smiled and said, "No matter what, it's a good thing that Zhang Shanfeng has a truly powerful master. It's just that our young friend was too impolite, hiding this from us the entire time and forcing me to worry about whether he was an external disciple from a third-rate force in the complete Reed continent. After all, most of the people claiming to be heavenly masters from Mount Longhu, who go outside to subdue demons and eliminate fiends, are just scammers. The world is swamped with these liars." I was filled with worry the entire time, and I carefully prodded around a few times to figure out whether Zhang Shanfeng was tricked into joining a force that scammed people of their money. If he had actually become the disciple of a weak fraudster by accident, then it would have been best for him to sever this relationship as early as possible. In fact, it would have been a good idea for him to not return to the northern complete Reed continent. In any case, maybe it's best that I didn't see what his master did, or else I would have had to pick up my jaw from the ground. Qian Pinyin smirked. He seemed to be taking pleasure in Su Yuanxia's misfortune. Su Yuanxia felt slightly hesitant at this moment. As the two of them slowly walked along the bluestone path surrounding the pond, Qian Pinyin said, "Big brother Su, feel free to speak your mind." Is there any need to be so polite with each other? During this trip to the Azure Phoenix Nation, Zhang Shanfeng went with me to bring that ash urn back to the person's family, Su Yuanxia replied. Then, I went with him to attend the liberation rite of water and land and the heavenly worship ceremony. To be honest, now that Zhang Shanfeng has returned to that heavenly master residence with his master, I'm also starting to miss home a little. Then take a trip home earlier, Chen Ping'an suggested with a faint smile. Su Yuanxia stopped and stroked his beard, saying, I've wandered around the outside world for so many years, and apart from sending some money and letters back home at set intervals, I have no idea what my hometown has become like now. Then how about I go with you? Chen Ping'an offered in a quiet voice. If you feel like it's inappropriate for Wei Xian and the others to go, then I'll only bring Pei Qian with me. I'll tell Wei Xian and the others to travel to the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation for now. Su Yuanxia smiled and shook his hand, replying, You're not a beautiful maiden or anything, so do I need you to accompany me home? You should follow your original plan. There's no need to change your plans for me. I never had any plan to begin with. What, is there something in your hometown that can't be exposed? Are you afraid of me seeing through your scam? Su Yuanxia sighed and squatted down beside the pond, using the pommel of his saber to gently tap the bluestone path. My family is pretty well off. They can probably be considered a prominent clan in the county. There was a marriage arranged for me, and I happened to take a glance at that young woman before I left home. She was fairly pretty and I did in fact like her. But I was extremely ambitious back then, and I felt like I could make a huge name for myself in just 3 to 5 years. Afterward, I could confidently strut into the town and give her a grand wedding. Yet before I knew it, I'd already been wandering around for more than 10 years. Chen Ping'an squatted down beside Su Yuanxia and consoled him. Big brother Su, you're an authentic 5th-tier martial artist who's also familiar with battle formations. If you return home, becoming a general in the imperial court shouldn't be too difficult, right? That's right, it won't be too difficult, Su Yuanxia replied with a nod. But then he sighed. The closer to home I get, the more nervous I become. However, this is quite a frightening response when I think about it. I was never this anxious and agonized even when I fought with my life on the line on the battlefield during my younger days. Chen Ping'an pondered on this for a moment. Since Su Yuanxia wanted to return home by himself, he naturally had his reasons for doing so. Thus, he said in a quiet voice, I plan to travel to Bamboo Scroll Lake Cyan Gorge Island next, and I'm going to look for a child called Gu Kan. He also lived in Clay Vase Alley back then, and he's now a disciple of Lu Jimao, the river-severing true lord. If everything goes well, then I'll travel to the Confucian Academy in the Great Sui Nation afterward and look for a few other children who also came from my hometown. Big brother Su, if you encounter any challenge back home that's too difficult for you to solve by yourself, then don't forget that you have 2 friends in the cultivation world who can help. Zhang Shanfeng might be difficult to reach now, but you can always contact me. Well, that might be a little troublesome as well. Make sure you deliver 2 letters at once, lest I miss your message. Su Yuanxia patted Chen Ping'an's shoulder before pointing at the pond in front of them and saying, My hometown can be compared to this pond. It's small and unable to be viewed as the cultivation world or whatnot. When as a 5th-tier martial artist with 2 decent weapons, this is more than enough for me to brag and show off. Even the provincial overseer will treat me as an esteemed guest. After all, do you think everyone is like you, Chen Ping'an? Chen Ping'an handed his sword nurturing gourd to Su Yuanxia and said in a soft voice, Here, have a taste of this. This is some genuinely good wine. If you like it, then you can take the wine with you. Of course, you can't take the wine gourd. Su Yuanxia was slightly skeptical, yet his face instantly flushed bright red after he took a sip of medicinal wine refined from the golden core of the nascent tear flood dragon from the vermilion wine gourd. The breath of true qi in his body was stirred, and it rushed past his acupoints like huge waves slamming into rock cliffs. Su Yuanxia hurriedly channeled his qi to stabilize his body, and it took him quite a bit of work to digest the intense effects of the medicinal wine. He burped and exhaled a breath of murky qi that had been stuck in his body for a long time and unable to be purified. He wiped his mouth and there was a bright glimmer in his eyes as he exclaimed, This wine is truly incredible. Martial artists only need to drink a single sip to see amazing results. Chen Ping'an was in no hurry to take back the sword nurturing gourd, so he crossed his arms and chuckled. Do you think everyone is like you, Su Yuanxia? Do you think everyone can drink some medicinal wine from this wine gourd? Su Yuanxia roared with laughter and didn't hold back anymore, tilting his head back and drinking another large mouthful of medicinal wine, using it to cleanse his pure true qi and expel any impurities. Not content with this, he took a third swig of medicinal wine and directly sat down cross-legged, remaining still for a long time like an old monk, Itotatim. When Su Yuanxia opened his eyes again, he handed the wine gourd to Qian Pingyan and said, "All right, 3's the limit. I finally have something to look forward to now, and I can dream about becoming a 6th-tier martial artist. 3 swigs of this wine is enough, and drinking any more will do more harm than good. My foundation as a martial artist isn't strong enough, so I can't drink too much of it. I'll ask you for more when I break through the final barrier of the 5th tier and advance to the 6th. Qian Pingyan was slightly puzzled. Then why not take the wine with you? This will save you the trouble of having to ask me for it later. Even though Qian Pingyan needed this medicinal wine to nurture his physique and soul right now, he had already embarked on the proper path of martial arts cultivation. Thus, not drinking this medicinal wine would simply result in his cultivation speed being somewhat slower. Back in Old Dragon City, this medicinal wine had been a huge help during a dire time, especially since Qian Pingyan had just been severely wounded by Du Mao's celestial weapon. Now, however, it was only icing on the cake. However, it was a different story for Su Yuanxia. This precious medicinal wine that couldn't be bought with money had profound implications for the big-bearded martial artists. Disregarding the Greatly Empire, the smaller nations of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent treated martial artists very differently depending on their cultivation base. Indeed, the difference between how 5th-tier martial artists and 6th-tier martial artists were treated was like the gulf between heaven and earth. In fact, 7th-tier martial artists might be powerful enough to affect the martial fortune of a small nation. That being the case, 6th-tier martial artists who had the potential to reach the 7th tier, the Vajrabadi tier, would naturally be treasured and recruited by the rulers of smaller nations. Su Yuanxia glanced at Qian Pingyan and replied, "This medicinal wine can accelerate one's cultivation and not leave behind any side effects, so it's obviously a top-notch treasure. But it isn't necessarily beneficial for martial artists who need to temper their mental state after advancing. With this medicinal wine, they'd inevitably start feeling lucky. They might not slack off on their physical training, but their mental state might become overly calm. If that's the case, then their fist techniques will naturally become limp and sluggish. Qian Pingyan, do you think martial artists of this world can control themselves and refrain from drinking this medicinal wine if each sip is able to help them advance their cultivation base?" Su Yuanxia gazed into the distance and sighed with emotion. "Even though I'm well aware that drinking too much of this medicinal wine will have a detrimental effect on my cultivation in the long run, I have to admit that I won't be able to control my impulse to drink it. In any case, I'm a drunkard after all. So will I give a damn about my cultivation roadblocks or whatnot once I start to drink? I'll enjoy myself to my heart's content before I start to think about these things." When it came to one's mental resolve on the path of cultivation, Su Yuanxia conceded that he was inferior to Zhang Shanfeng and even more inferior to Qian Pingyan. Qian Pingyan nodded and said, "Then I'll wait for you to reach the 6th tier first. When that time comes, I'll give you this wine as a celebration wine. When you travel north this time, don't forget to pay Sword Saint Song and those 2 children in Blusher Prefecture a visit if you have the opportunity to travel through the Colorful Garment Nation and the Water-Combing Nation," Su Yuanxia suddenly said. "Of course, you should also visit that couple in the Ghost Estate." Qian Pingyan smiled and replied, "Naturally. I need to treat old Senior Song to some hot pot, and I need to check on those 2 children to see whether their cultivation journeys are going smoothly. I also need to visit that old estate to try out the old granny's braised pork with dried bamboo shoots." Su Yuanxia laughed heartily. Cultivation and wealth aside, Qian Pingyan was still the same Qian Pingyan as before. He patted the young man's shoulder again, exerting much more force than last time. His voice was filled with energy and vigor as he said, "Qian Pingyan, both you and Zhang Shanfeng need to cultivate earnestly and make a name for yourselves. When you guys become successful and renowned in the future, I'll also be able to boast in front of other people when I hear of your feats in my hometown. At that time, countless people will cry and shout as they beg me to drink with them and tell them stories about you and Zhang Shanfeng." Qian Pingyan cupped his fists and said in amusement, Thanks for your blessings, Big Brother Su. Su Yuanxia stood up and said, All right, it was still okay before when we were randomly strolling around, and I didn't really feel anything. But now that I'm thinking about home, it's as if my stomach is craving wine and causing an uprising. It will feel terrible if I don't take a sip. Haha, that pot of old wine is none other than my hometown. It's time to set off. Chen Ping'an also stood up saying, Then I'll accompany you to your room to pack up. I'll go with you for a short distance. Su Yunxia shot a glare at him and scolded. Why so sentimental? You need to learn from Zhang Shanfeng when it comes to farewells. Look at how straightforward and quick he was. He immediately left when it was necessary. Chen Ping'an rolled his eyes and retorted. Him? I'll be quite impressed if Zhang Shanfeng isn't crying right now. In fact, why don't we have a bet on this? Su Yunxia rubbed his chin and said, There's no one to bet with. That idiot is hiding from his master and secretly bawling his eyes out. Chen Ping'an also rubbed his chin, saying, Is this a case of great minds thinking alike? Su Yuanxia laughed and strode away, telling Chen Ping'an that there was no need to see him off. However, the big-bearded martial artist suddenly remembered that it was late at night, and it was very possible that many women and children had already gone to bed. Thus, he quietened down and waved farewell with his back facing Chen Ping'an. He didn't hesitate or pause at all. Standing there, Chen Ping'an inevitably felt the slight sorrow of parting. Around 30 minutes later, Pei Qian slowly trudged over with sleepy eyes. Running through the alleyways at night was quite terrifying, so that yellow paper talisman was once again stuck on her forehead. After finding Chen Ping'an, she asked in puzzlement, Why is the big-bearded uncle running away? Does he owe you money, master? Is he unable to repay it so he feels too ashamed to show his face? So he's sneaking away at night. Pei Qian felt extremely irritated by this, so she angrily stomped her feet and punched her palm before fuming. That poor uncle with a big beard is far too disloyal. If he doesn't have enough money to repay his debts, then he can secretly borrow some from me. It's not like I'll expose his embarrassing actions to master or anything. She wasn't sure why, but she had a nagging feeling that Chen Ping'an had been unusually happy the entire time after meeting the young Taoist priest with mediocre talent and the big-bearded uncle with a supremely loud voice. It seemed like he was even happier than if he had made a lot of money. In reality, however, ever since meeting the yellow earth bull at the mountain pass, her master had lost money, and then lost some more money. Indeed, hadn't he given Zhang Shanfeng an azure wooden box? One that held some kind of important seal? Moreover, during their trip from Old Dragon City to Wasptail Ferry Station, had her master been willing to drink his osmanthus wine and well-water immortal wine every single day? By the looks of it, making friends in the cultivation world was completely meaningless. After all, doing so would cause a person to lose all of their money. Chen Ping'an smiled and shook his head, correcting, Your big-bearded uncle simply misses home. We can look for him in the future, and you can also look for him by yourself when you start to travel around the cultivation world. You'll most likely be old enough to drink at that time, so you need to remember to bring some good wine when you visit him. Pei Qian shook her head and said, The cultivation world is teeming with dangers, and wine is far too expensive. I've decided that I won't travel around the cultivation world. Chen Ping'an twisted her ear and scolded. Just how old are you? And you're telling me that the cultivation world is teeming with dangers? Pei Qian stood on her tippy toes and begged for mercy, saying, Old Man Wei and the big-bearded uncle both said the same thing. I felt like it was quite impressive and gallant when they said this, so I decided to casually repeat it as well. Chen Ping'an let go of her ear and chuckled. Use the 6-step walking meditation to go back to your room and sleep. Pei Qian could perform the 6-step walking meditation decently well now, but she was still unable to capture the essence of standing meditation and the corresponding sword furnace stance. As for the heaven and earth stance, Pei Qian was indeed very interested in learning this. However, she couldn't grasp this stance no matter what. This was because she couldn't even do a handstand yet. An uneventful night passed by. The rooster started to crow very early in the mountain village, but Chen Ping'an didn't go out for a stroll after waking up. This was because the martial arts practitioners in the village were about to gather and train together in around half an hour. They would train together in the morning and at night, and they would persist with this training day after day, year after year. This was the case for all men in the village, whether they were young boys or grown men. In fact, even women were allowed to join if they wanted to. Many people in this village went on to work as armed escorts, so it would naturally be difficult to build a good reputation if one didn't possess solid martial arts skills. According to the village teacher, the reputation of their clan leader, known as Chen's Archway, was extremely useful in this province of the Azure Phoenix Nation when descendants of the Chan clan went to work as armed escorts or travel around the cultivation world. When Chen Ping'an walked past the martial arts training ground of the Chan clan yesterday, he didn't stop to observe like he had observed the martial arts school in the Lotus Flower-blessed land. Instead, he had briskly walked past and left. Not only that, but Chen Ping'an even spoke with the 4 martial artists from the Lotus Flower-blessed land, especially Lu Baixiang and Sui Yubian, and told them that it was best to avoid walking around with weapons in this mountain village. They needed to adapt to the local traditions and customs. On this morning, Chen Ping'an and his companions gathered together to eat breakfast. After finishing breakfast, they would prepare to leave the village and head to the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Before leaving the country, Chen Ping'an wanted to watch the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism, which the emperor had spent all of his effort organizing. Apart from Wasptail Ferry Station, located at the intersection of 3 nations, there was also another immortal ferry station located in the eastern regions of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Apparently, it was slightly larger than Wasptail Ferry Station. Back in Wasptail Ferry Station, Chen Ping'an and the others had heard that war and chaos were ravaging the central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent, and this was the case for both cultivators in the mountains and people outside the mountains. Thus, many intercontinental ships heading to this area had stopped running. There was no ferry station above Bamboo Scroll Lake, and the 2 ferry stations nearest to it were located in the heavily guarded area of a nation's capital and an immortal force in the mountains. However, both places were affected by the chaotic wars, with the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire trampling all over the lands and sending blood flying everywhere. Thus, Chen Ping'an wanted to try his luck with the ferry station located in the eastern regions of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Otherwise, the distance to Bamboo Scroll Lake would be far too great to cover on foot. While sitting around a table and eating congee, Chen Ping'an and the others suddenly turned around to look toward the courtyard located outside the dining room. A snow-white figure appeared extremely eye-catching as it gracefully hovered out from the shadows of the corridor and stood still. There was a dazzling smile on this person's face. It was a young boy in white with an immortal aura. He appeared even more ethereal than Chen Ping'an. Pei Qian dazedly stared at the uninvited guest, and for some unknown reason, she hurriedly took out the Treasure Pagoda demon-suppressing talisman and slapped it on her forehead. Chen Ping'an put his chopsticks down and heaved a soft sigh. Wei Xian and the others were slightly puzzled. Apart from this person's outstanding appearance and outfit, they couldn't determine his strength or cultivation base at all. In fact, they couldn't even determine whether he was an immortal from the mountains or a pure martial artist. This made them feel less and less confidence. Chen Ping'an stood up and walked over, stopping near the door threshold before asking, "Why did you come here?" With tears in his eyes and his lips quivering, the young boy sobbed and shouted as he ran over to Chen Ping'an, seemingly wanting to hug him and lament about the pain of separation. It was a very touching sight. "Master, I've caused you to suffer so much by arriving too late. Disciple Cui Dongshan deserves to die 100 times over to make up for his sins." Arg! Chen Ping'an directly raised a foot and kicked his repulsive disciple away. Pei Qian widened her eyes in astonishment. Where had this person suddenly come out from? By the looks of it, he was trying to snatch her master away? Cui Dongshan spun countless times in the air, with his large sleeves fluttering around like beautiful white clouds pushed away by the outstretched hand of an immortal. Cui Dongshan wiped away his tears after landing on the ground. He then jogged over and lamented, "Master, you must have had a difficult time camping in the wilderness while traveling more than 1,000,000 kilometers through the world. You must have suffered far too much. Yet, as your disciple, I was unable to accompany you and make life easier for you. I deserve to be punished. I truly deserve to be punished." Lu Baixiang immediately understood the situation. He remembered that Chen Ping'an had once mentioned something about an unofficial disciple who was seeking knowledge in the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy. This unofficial disciple of his was very good at playing Go, so Chen Ping'an had told Lu Baixiang that he could play Go with this person if he had an opportunity in the future. Chen Ping'an returned inside and sat down at the dining table. Pei Qian, who still had the yellow paper talisman stuck to her forehead, hesitated for a moment before vacating her seat and walking over to sit next to Sui Yubian. Cui Dongshan strode inside. Yet he didn't sit down next to Chen Ping'an. Instead, he first went to the kitchen to grab himself a bowl and a pair of chopsticks. Afterward, he chose to sit down next to Lu Baixiang. He was just about to grab a piece of fermented bean curd to go with his congee, yet he suddenly put his chopsticks down and sighed. My heart aches so much that I can't bring myself to eat. Chen Ping'an cut to the chase and asked, Did you make your way over because you read that letter that I sent to Li Baoping? But why are you coming to the Azure Phoenix Nation? After all, I was always planning to visit Mountain Cliff Academy to look for you guys. Perhaps you're here for the debate between Buddhism and Taoism. Cui Dongshan smiled and replied, That debate is nothing more than a bunch of little chicks fighting for food. There's nothing interesting about it. I'm afraid that I might accidentally slip up and, under the watchful gazes of everyone, the boastful young immortal suddenly slapped himself and scolded. Will you die if you don't boast? Chen Ping'an didn't ask anything else, so Cui Dongshan also fell silent as he started to eat. His chopsticks became a blur, and it was clear that he was famished. Lu Baixiang turned to Cui Dongshan and asked, Do you mind playing a game of Go when you're free? Cui Dongshan didn't even bother to turn around as he waved a hand dismissively and replied, I don't know how to play Go. Everyone felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from their shoulders when he finally disappeared from view. Zhu Lian was standing at the entrance of the kitchen and drying his hands. He looked toward Wei Xian, who was sitting on the steps, and asked with a smile, What are your thoughts? I see a large fish in a deep river, Wei Xian replied in a calm voice. Meanwhile, Lu Baixiang turned to Sui Yubian and asked, Do you think this person views me as too unskilled to play Go with him? Or do you think he's too afraid to make a fool of himself? Sui Yubian dodged the question and responded, His physical body is quite strange. Pei Qian was poking her head outside the door to observe the situation in the courtyard, as if she was trying to hide from that handsome young boy in elegant white robes. It was as if she feared that he would suddenly dash over from the corridor in the blink of an eye. By the looks of it, she was genuinely very afraid of Cui Dongshan. They had only eaten a single meal together, yet Pei Qian already viewed Cui Dongshan as if he were a ferocious beast. Chen Ping'an strolled around the alleys of the mountain village with Cui Dongshan, walking along the smooth and mirror-like paths paved from bluestone slabs. Cui Dongshan obediently walked behind Chen Ping'an, and the master and disciple appeared like two white sparrows as they walked between the tall walls of the slightly dim alley with a bluestone path. Then Cui Dongshan quickened his pace and walked next to Chen Ping'an, holding one hand behind his back and slapping the wall with his other hand as he said quietly, Master, I heard that you obtained the yang body of Du Mao, that ascension tier cultivator. Is that right? This yang body is equivalent to the physical body of an immortal tier cultivator, and its toughness is able to rival that of 9th tier martial artists. Not to mention, Du Mao has already tempered and refined this yang body into something like a small world. In other words, whoever occupies this body has a guaranteed path to the upper 5 tiers. Chen Ping'an raised an eyebrow. You heard? Heard from whom exactly? Cui Dongshan smiled faintly and replied, Those from the mountains naturally have their clever ways, and your disciple naturally has his own. You want this immortal yang body? Chen Ping'an directly asked. Cui Dongshan's expression became complicated, and he shook his head and replied, My current body is an immortal body left behind by an ancient immortal. Moreover, it's the body of some type of flood dragon from the ancient Shu nation, so it's just as valuable as Du Mao's yang body, if not more. But with that said, who won't be tempted by such a rare and valuable treasure? Master, if you take pity on me and decides to bestow the yang body upon me with a wave of his hand, then I'll naturally shed tears of gratitude and be willing to loyally serve you. Where can I find a powerful entity who's compatible with this immortal yang body? Chen Ping'an asked. Do I need a heroic spirit from some ancient battlefield? Or do I need a ghost general or ghost king from some unmarked burial ground? Cui Dongshan grinned widely and replied, It seems like you are quite familiar with the concept of occupying an immortal body. However, I have some bad news to tell you. Whether it's ancient battlefields brimming with countless soldiers and generals or unmarked burial grounds housing the corpses of hundreds of thousands of victims, The yin entities produced by these places are far too lowly. In terms of cultivation base, they'll be at the nascent tier at the very most. That's simply insufficient to occupy and suppress an immortal body. If such a yin entity enters this immortal body, it will be like throwing a bucket of boiling oil into a barrel of water. Both sides will repel and erode each other, leading to a mutually destructive outcome. At the end of the day, it's up to your own skills and fortune to see whether you can find a yin entity with suitably strong aptitude and affinity. That's the important aspect. As for the cultivation base of the yin entity, that isn't especially important. Qian Ping'an silently committed this to memory. He then said, "We're about to set off for the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and we might pass by a chief military governor's official residence on our way there. We might not visit this official residence, but the chief military governor might look for us anyway. I want to let you know about this beforehand." Cui Dongshan cupped his hands and bowed in respect, replying, "I'll listen to your instructions, master. I don't have any complaints." For the next 5 days, Cui Dongshan would occasionally flatter Qian Ping'an as they traversed mountains and crossed rivers. Apart from this, he seldom interacted with Pei Qian and the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls, with almost no words spoken between them. It was as if Qian Ping'an had gained a lazy follower who had only appeared extraordinary during his initial appearance. Afterward, Cui Dongshan had appeared completely idle and mediocre. He didn't observe the games of Go between Liu Baixiang and Sui Yubian, nor did he watch Pei Qian when she practiced her deranged demon sword techniques. He never helped Julian cook either. From the morning until night, all he did was giddily follow Qian Ping'an around. On this day, they arrived at a small county city that had both a scholarly temple and a martial sage temple. The former had few worshippers and incense offerings, while the latter was enjoying a large number of worshippers and an abundance of incense offerings. It was said that this martial sage temple was incredibly effective at granting wealth after all, so how could it not be popular? Boisterous and bustling during the day, the martial sage temple became much more peaceful and quiet at night. Unlike other temples and shrines in the local regions, scholarly temples and martial sage temples generally didn't close at night. After resting in the county city during the day, Qian Ping'an and Cui Dongshan decided to visit the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple at night. Qian Ping'an told Wei Xian and the others to stay back at the inn to protect Pei Qian. The two of them visited the scholarly temple first, and a scholarly official who had been bestowed the posthumous title of Wenjin was honored in this temple. He had once worked as an official in the prefecture and brought prosperity to the region, so many scholarly temples in the area, regardless of their size, had chosen to enshrine and honor him. Why were they visiting the scholarly temple at night? This was because Qian Ping'an had stood atop a distant mountain and gazed over at the county city not long ago, and he had vaguely noticed that dark clouds were gathered above 2 locations in the city. These dark clouds were filled with murderous aura, and they slowly permeated through the county city. After Qian Ping'an noticed this abnormal situation, Cui Dongshan had casually revealed the secret behind it, saying, "The scholarly temple and the martial sage temple have fallen victim to a sinister plot, and some cultivators are using these 2 temples as gateways to forcefully channel and steal someone's fortunes." While offering incense in the temples recently, some locals with innate cultivation aptitude might have seen the divine statues of the scholarly sage or the martial sage shed tears of blood. Some of them might have even received warnings from the 2 deities in their dreams. However, Qian Ping'an and Cui Dongshan didn't find anything out of the ordinary when they walked around the scholarly temple. Apart from the yin energy being slightly more concentrated, the divine statue didn't perform any divine deeds. It was nothing more than a clay statue that lacked incense offerings and vitality. While leaving, Cui Dongshan smiled and explained, "We're outsiders after all, and we've never offered incense in the scholarly temple either. This local deity had a weak spirit to begin with, and it's already beginning to wane even further. Materializing and conversing with us will be extremely difficult. Moreover, this deity is understandably suspicious of us, so it may as well remain in hiding and wait for death. This is naturally a better outcome than recklessly leaving its gold statue and being captured by ill-intentioned qi refiners through methods such as soul-binding techniques. Falling into the hands of such people might imply a more pitiful fate than having their gold statue destroyed. A sense of worry immediately gripped at Qian Pingan's heart when they arrived at the martial sage temple. Even though the temple was already empty, with no one lighting and offering incense, Qian Pingan could still see wisps of curling smoke rising from the countless sticks of incense when he looked closely. However, though everything seemed to be thriving, there was a hint of Qi energy cutting through the image. And this wasn't all. When Qian Pingan walked over to the large censer and pinched some remnant pieces of the incense sticks, they quickly transformed into ashes and released a vaguely foul aura. Cui Dongshan had already strode inside the main hall, and started to carefully observe the 3-meter-tall gold statue with his hands clasped behind his back. This was the martial sage temple of a small county city that didn't have much gold to gild statues, so it was only natural that the clay statues of the deities weren't especially large. Right now, the trapped deity was stuck in a deep slumber, with only two things that it could do. It could either appear in the dreams of the local residents and officials and warn them of the situation, or it could struggle to resist the gradual contamination caused by the incense smoke from impure sources. After Qian Pingan entered the main hall as well, Cui Dongshan extended a hand and flicked his sleeve, saying with a faint smile, "Master, you can borrow this opportunity to witness the manifestation of martial fortune in this world." After Cui Dongshan finished speaking, Qian Pingan immediately heard a ding-dong sound in his mind's lake. Looking up, he saw a golden water drop fall down from high up and eventually land in the censer in front of the divine statue's feet, causing numerous ripples to spread outward. Qian Pingan waited for a long time, yet no other golden water drop was forthcoming. Cui Dongshan sniggered and said, "This is the martial fortune of the Azure Phoenix Nation. If this were the Lu Empire from the past, any random martial sage temple could have produced drop after drop of golden rainwater, so many that they would have quickly formed a stream. This is unrelated to the rank of a deity. It's solely determined by the lifespan and martial fortune of a nation. Moreover, ordinary qi refiners will be unable to witness this, even if they're powerful earth immortals. I'm simply aware of some ancient secret techniques and have learned a few abilities pertaining to the Tao of gods and deities from the old man in the small town's medicine shop, and it's because of this that I can make visible the manifestation of this nation's martial fortune. As for the water-combing nation, the colorful garment nation, and the other nations that I visited before meeting up with you, I have to say that they're even inferior to the Azure Phoenix nation, which can only produce a single drop of golden incense fluid every 15 minutes. Perhaps these nations can only produce a single drop of golden incense fluid every 30 or 40 minutes. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, another golden water drop representing the martial fortune of the Azure Phoenix nation fell down. Qian Pingan came to a slight realization. The sword spirit had called Pei Qian a martial fortune prodigy back in Old Dragon City, and that was the first time he had ever heard of such a title. Combining that with Cui Dongshan's explanations tonight, Qian Pingan was starting to get a clearer picture of the situation. This was presumably a mystical ability in the same vein as how the water goddess of the burial river could determine the quality of her incense offerings, and how there were many spiritual herbs and plants in the immortal mountains that could assist cultivators in examining the fortunes of mountains and rivers. Qian Pingan smiled and asked, "Are you waiting for me to ask about the situation in the martial sage temples of the Great Li Empire?" Cui Dongshan cupped his hands and chuckled with his head lowered, replying, "Master is truly able to see through all worldly matters. You have only traveled through the world for a short few years, yet you've already become so sharp and perceptive. As expected of a divine prodigy. As expected of an immortal being." Qian Pingan shot a glance at Cui Dongshan and hesitated for a moment. However, he eventually decided to ask, "Won't the manifestation of martial fortune in the Great Duan Empire, the empire with the martial goddess, appear even more magnificent than that of the Lu Empire? You lose home nation?" Cui Dongshan laughed loudly and replied, "Naturally. Otherwise, how could the divinely wealthy Lu clan of the pure white continent be willing to put its wager on the Great Duan Empire? Apart from the commercialists and diplomatists, many other schools from the 100 schools of thought also chose the Great Duan Empire." A slight hint of disappointment appeared on Cui Dongshan's face as he continued, "Apart from viewing the martial fortune of a nation through the golden water drops in a martial sage temple, one can actually observe even more in the official martial sage temple of a nation's capital. In fact, one can even observe the fluctuation of martial fortune due to certain people's actions." Cui Dongshan walked over to sit on the door threshold of the main hall. Looking up at the trapped and lusterless divine statue of the martial god, he sighed with emotion and said, "Some years ago, I heard that a young boy with terrifying martial fortune appeared in the Great Duan Empire. On the day that he became an official citizen of the Great Duan Empire, the martial fortune that was already very spectacular in all of the martial sage temples directly transformed from a stream into a thundering waterfall. The censers became like deep pools, and countless golden water drops splashed into the surroundings. This caused extremely loud rumbling, and gods and deities were able to hear this commotion from very far away." Chun Ping'an smiled and remarked, "That person's called Chao Ci. I ran across him in the Sword Chi Great Wall, and I even fought against him 3 times. However, I lost all 3 battles, and I wholeheartedly accepted my losses. I hope that I can still keep up with him in the future, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to spar again." Looking at Chun Ping'an's calm smile and listening to his genuine words, Cui Dongshan raised a thumb and sincerely praised him. "Master, you are so impressive. Your ambitions are so lofty." These words didn't sound like flattery at all. If there were outsiders present, for example the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls, they might even feel like Cui Dongshan was being sarcastic and delivering a backhanded compliment. But Chun Ping'an was well aware that Cui Dongshan was being completely sincere at this moment. These were probably the most sincere words that he had spoken in a while. However, Cui Dongshan immediately sighed in grief, with an expression of lamentation spreading across his face. "Master, you are so unlucky to be born in the same generation as this person." Chun Ping'an walked toward the door, and Cui Dongshan also stood up to exit the main hall alongside his master. Chun Ping'an suddenly turned around at this moment and asked, "Did Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan detect some changes in the martial fortune of the Great Li Empire's official martial sage temple? Is that why he sent you over as a messenger? Is he afraid that I'll become a citizen of another nation along with Wei Xian and the others? For example, the Great Sui Nation?" Cui Dongshan didn't flatter Chun Ping'an this time, and he simply nodded and replied, The old divine lord over there received some news and learned that you were about to start cultivating and now need to refine some bonded items. The Imperial Preceptor suggested that a transaction be made, and this involves Wei Xian, Sui Yubian, Zhu Lian, and Lu Baixiang becoming citizens of the Great Li Empire. If you agree, then the Great Li Empire can help you regarding the refinement of 5-colored soil as one of your bonded items. The Empire can tell you the final locations of the 5 mountains in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Moreover, the Empire can also prepare 5 kilograms of soil from the roots of each of the 5 mountains. This will be enough for Master to refine your bonded item 2 times over. Before Chun Ping'an could say anything, Cui Dongshan had already opened his mouth again and explained, "It's a matter of urgency for you to refine your second bonded item. However, there's no need to worry. Apart from Cloud Drape Mountain, the northern mountain that Wei Bo is ruling over, there are only some slight indications about the southern mountain that Fan Jun Mao will rule over. As for the central mountain, eastern mountain and western mountain, the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan does indeed have thoughts about which mountains to choose. However, they might not be able to successfully appoint these mountains in the next 10 to 20 years. In any case, there's no need for you to worry about these things. This is actually a positive outcome, especially since refining the 5-colored soil will be much easier now compared to the future. Moreover, you have only just started to cultivate as a chi refiner, so there's no need for you to refine bonded items that are too high in quality. When the 5 mountains are fully recognized by the Imperial Court of the Great Li Empire and the Confucian School in the Middle Earth Divine Continent, allowing them to become linked with the fortune of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, then the quality of your bonded item will naturally rise in leaps and bounds as well." Chun Ping'an and Cui Dongshan left the martial sage temple and walked along the large street blanketed by the night sky. As they walked, Chun Ping'an asked, "This is a transaction that Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan wants to do with me, but what do you think, Cui Dongshan?" Cui Dongshan stopped and asked, "Are you willing to trust me, Master?" Chun Ping'an shook his head and replied, "No, but I do want to hear your opinion, even if it's a lie." Cui Dongshan couldn't help but chuckle. After thinking for a moment, he said, "Then please listen to some of my lies, Master. In your disciples' eyes, having the 4 of them become citizens of the Great Li Empire will bring a myriad of benefits and 0 harm to you. You can use this as a starting point for your discussions with the Great Li Empire and obtain 5 kilograms of 5-colored soil from each of the 5 mountains. As for whether you will change your citizenship from the Great Li Empire to the Great Sui Nation or some other random place, it won't be too late to make this decision when the 5 mountains of the Great Li Empire become officially recognized in the future. As for what you will do during this time and whether you refine the 5-colored soil as your bonded item or not, this won't take away from the fact that obtaining the 5-colored soil is a definitive benefit. In other words, it's better to accept the benefits now. Chen Ping'an remained silent and continued to walk forward. After taking several steps, he noticed that Cui Dongshan was still standing in the same spot. Chen Ping'an looked back and Cui Dongshan chuckled. I'll take a look at the unfortunate situation surrounding the Scholarly Temple and the Martial Sage Temple tonight. If there are sinister cultivators and demons causing trouble, then I'll deliver justice on behalf of the heavens and earn some hidden virtue for you. But if this is caused by impure teachings and the local residents committing sins themselves, then please allow me to stand aside and do nothing. We'll allow these temples to decide their own fates. Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, I'm fine with that. He then turned around, planning to return to the inn. Master! Cui Dongshan suddenly called. What's wrong? Chen Ping'an turned around and asked. Cui Dongshan was filled with righteous indignation as he exclaimed, Those 4 pure martial artists who are as measly as ants are so disrespectful toward you even though they're your subordinates. I've conducted myself as a discipleship these past few days, and I could only observe their behaviors without saying anything. This was a devastating experience. I beseech you, Master, please allow me to teach them properly from tomorrow onward. Chen Ping'an smiled and asked, How do you plan to teach them? Standing on the steps in front of the Martial Sage Temple's entrance, Cui Dongshan replied in a righteous voice, I'll naturally abide by your teachings and educate them through reasoning and virtue. Chen Ping'an didn't say anything else, and he hastily headed back to the inn. While walking back, he mulled over Cui Dongshan's true reasons for coming to this place. Why had he suddenly left the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy? Du Mao's immortal body that many people coveted, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan's proposed transaction, and the dark undercurrent accompanying the debate between Buddhism and Taoism in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Chen Ping'an had a nagging feeling that Cui Dongshan had come here for all of these 3 reasons. However, these weren't the main reasons. Far behind Chen Ping'an, Cui Dongshan turned around and walked up the steps, yawning as he returned inside the Martial Sage Temple. Chen Ping'an returned to the inn, and he discovered that Pei Qian wasn't the only one who had yet to sleep. Right now, she was mucking around and blowing the yellow paper talisman stuck to her forehead. Meanwhile, the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls were also gathered in a room, and waiting for the results of Chen Ping'an's trip. Chen Ping'an was slightly puzzled about this. Traveling from the central region of the Parasol Leaf continent all the way to the Azure Phoenix Nation in the southeast region of the eastern Treasured Vial continent, they had already experienced so many dangers and life-and-death battles. Thus, Wei Xian and the others shouldn't have developed such a keen interest in the Scholarly Temple and the Martial Sage Temple of a measly county city. Even if sinister wind and demonic rain howled through a small place, it was almost certain that they wouldn't be able to cause any large ripples. However, Chen Ping'an quickly understood the reason behind their behavior. It was extremely likely that his disciple Cui Dongshan would unleash his skills for the first time tonight, so it was only natural that Wei Xian, Sui Yubian, Zhu Lian, and Lu Baixiang were paying close attention. After Chen Ping'an sat down, Zhu Lian walked over and offered him a cup of tea. Chen Ping'an was straightforward and honest as he explained, Someone has indeed tampered with the Scholarly Temple and the Martial Sage Temple. Cui Dongshan will deal with this issue, and it won't delay our journey tomorrow. Sui Yubian had the most straightforward personality out of the 4 martial artists, and she asked directly, Is Cui Dongshan genuinely your disciple? Chen Ping'an patted Pei Qian's head and told her to go to sleep. However, Pei Qian replied that she couldn't fall asleep and was afraid of ghosts. She also said that she liked to kick her blanket, so what would she do if the yellow paper talisman on her forehead came loose and fell somewhere? If that happened, then wouldn't the ghosts and demons have an opportunity to target her? Wouldn't that render her unable to protect Big Sister Sui? Chen Ping'an had indeed explained the rules and taboos pertaining to talismans to Pei Qian before. For example, Talismans were able to deter sinister beings when one traversed mountains and crossed rivers. At the same time, talismans would also instill a sense of respect and apprehension in the minds of some low-ranked deities and ghosts. However, talismans were also like bright lamps that could easily attract the attention of some malicious ghosts that were unafraid of yang energy, causing them to increasingly detest a person and covet their treasures. With this in mind, Qian Pingyan didn't force Pei Qian to return next door to sleep. He looked at Cui Yubian and replied, "Even though Cui Dongshan was the one who shamelessly followed me around in the beginning, he is indeed a genuine disciple of mine now. After traveling together for a while, you guys should be roughly aware of his personality and temper as well. He's a fairly haughty person, and he won't be inclined to target you unless you offend or provoke him. There are many rules and regulations when traveling around the majestic world, for example, all those things I said to Pei Qian before. The waters are more dangerous than the mountains, there's no need to wait when entering temples to pray if there are too many people, and so on." Actually, it was Cui Dongshan who told me these things when I traveled around the world with him in the past. However, speaking this truth would be too hurtful, and Qian Pingyan couldn't bring himself to be so blunt. For example, on the day of their reunion, Cui Dongshan directly mentioned Du Mao's immortal body and begged Qian Pingyan to generously bestow it upon him. In reality, however, Cui Dongshan probably didn't care much about the immortal body at all. Even though Cui Dongshan was willing to interact with Qian Pingyan, it was likely that his gaze was focused elsewhere, peering into the shadows and the curtains located extremely far away. He was peering at the deceased Mr. Qi, the imprisoned scholarly sage, who no longer had a physical body and was integrating with the Tao of the majestic world. Aoyang, who had already ascended to the heavens beyond heavens and was sparring with the Taoist second disciple, and Taoist branch master Lu Chan, who was now overseeing the 5 cities and 12 pagodas in White Jade capital. The fact that the Great Li Empire had been able to build a replica of White Jade capital's sword pagoda was evidence of naturalist cultivators and Mahist cultivators being present. There was also True Martial Mountain and Wind Snow Temple, both of which were military and ancestral forces in the eastern treasured Vile continent. Of the two, the former had an extremely close relationship with the Great Li Empire. In addition, there was also Old Dragon City, which was bustling with wealthy merchants. As for the 100 schools of thought that were independent of the 3 teachings, only the legalists and diplomatists were yet to show themselves out of the most powerful schools. In other words, the Great Li Empire was already favored by my forces outside the eastern treasured Vile continent. This was what gave the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan the confidence and strength to conquer half of the eastern treasured Vile continent. Song Chongjing and the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire were on an expedition of conquest on the surface, while the matter of how to defend and maintain their territory was a test of the Great Li Empire's influence and power. Qian Pingyan had mulled over and understood these things after traveling through the river of time in the lotus flower-blessed land. Perhaps he was still a fair way off the truth, but the general direction of his thinking was most likely correct. Moreover, the southward expedition of the Great Li Empire was like a complicated game of Go that involved many parties. As for the person who was planning everything and helping the Imperial Song clan keep on top of all matters, that was none other than the young immortal in white who had re-entered the martial sage temple by himself. Looking back on his long journeys, Qian Pingyan discovered that each step of his had landed squarely inside Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan's Go board. During his travels in the eastern treasured Vile continent, from his journey through the Great Sui Nation and the vassal Yellow Court Nation in the north, the Colorful Garment Nation, the Ancient Elm Nation, and the Watercombing Nation in the central region, and to Old Dragon City in the south, he had never stepped outside the Go board, not even once. It was just that Cui Chan and Cui Dongshan, 2 halves of a soul split into an old body and a young body, had paid no heed to Qian Pingyan afterward. Lu Baixiang smiled and asked, "Is Mr. Cui a cultivator with a profound cultivation base? Is he someone who's returned to a state of natural simplicity?" Qian Pingyan didn't know how to respond, so he could only say, "He was once a proper Confucian disciple from the eastern treasured Vile continent. Afterward, he left his hometown and traveled to the Middle-earth divine continent to seek knowledge. His cultivation base was quite high before, but it took a significant hit afterward. I can't tell what his current cultivation base is, and I didn't ask him about it either." Zhu Lian smiled with squinted eyes and remarked, Young master, you said before that powerful cultivators in this world possess strong physiques that are no weaker than those of pure martial artists at the 3 mind-tempering tiers. So I'm quite curious about just how powerful his fist techniques are. If he combines his strength with some immortal treasures, can he potentially break through Wei Xian's Du armor? Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "Let me say this first. You guys are free to probe or challenge Cui Dongshan if you want. I definitely won't stop you. However, you also have to take responsibility for the consequences. I definitely don't dare to fight for the title of opening disciple with him, so I'll just call him senior brother in the future," Pei Qian commented in a quiet voice. Cui Dongshan pushed the door open and entered the room, huffing in anger. "Little girl, why are you calling people names behind their backs? Just who are you calling senior brother? You're a bloody senior brother. Can you speak properly, or what?" Pei Qian immediately became pale with fright when she heard Cui Dongshan's mysterious and angry remarks. "How's the situation in the martial sage temple?" Chen Ping'an asked. Cui Dongshan poured himself a cup of tea and downed it in a single gulp before smiling and replying, "Everything is already settled. I met both the masterminds behind the issues in the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple, and both of them were relatively good-tempered and easy to talk to. If I weren't in a hurry to return and report the situation to Master, then it's entirely possible that the deities of the 2 temples would have invited the mountain lords over and retrieved those pots of wine buried deep underground to express their gratitude toward me. We might have happily drank wine and chatted until tomorrow morning." "Who was causing trouble?" Chen Ping'an asked in puzzlement. Cui Dongshan smiled and replied, "It was a wealthy local who was afraid of death and wanted to live for an extra 20 or 30 years. He has a descendant who's now a member of an immortal cultivation force in the Azure Phoenix Nation, and this descendant didn't learn any good habits and learned a whole heap of bad habits instead. He only learned some of the most basic heretical techniques, yet he actually wanted to change someone's fate with these measly skills, wreaking havoc on the fortune of an area and transforming this into the lifespan of someone else. The chaos caused in the area naturally led to a conflict between the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple. Moreover, cultivators who have learned some immortal techniques, especially those so-called young prodigies in the small forces, often have pretty bad tempers. After some slight conflict, the heretical descendant of the wealthy local even tried to steal the gold statues of the deities. From what I've heard, the illegal temples in the Fortune Mountain Nation and the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent have largely been raided and shut down by the imperial courts of each nation. Even so, demand for the shards of gold statues still outstrips supply. Now that issues have appeared with the incense offerings in the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple, it's quite obvious that the local cultivators are acting a little too wantonly. However, they haven't taken things far enough for the virtuous scholars of the Confucian academies to hunt them down and punish them with death. If the young cultivator and his backers managed to plan things out properly, they could have directly resolved this issue in the imperial study of the Azure Phoenix Nation. News of this wouldn't even reach Lakeview Academy. Chen Ping'an's mood became somber when he heard this, and he drank a small sip of medicinal wine from his sword-nurturing gourd. Cui Dongshan appeared unfazed, and it was as if he didn't notice his master's stern expression at all. There was a wide smile on his face as he continued. Deities in the mountains and rivers also have their own fates and fortunes depending on whether their deeds are good or bad. In any case, this current situation is only an acceleration of the inevitable. Once the Great Li Empire genuinely conquers the entire continent, it's without a doubt that all of these forbidden and illegal temples will be targeted. In fact, the Great Li Empire will be even more vicious and swift. Right now, officials from the Ministry of Rites are already working together with officials from the Ministry of Astronomy in the regions to the north of Lakeview Academy, which is located in the central region of the continent. They're starting to locate and shut down all of the illegal temples in those regions. During the 2 years that you were away from the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, more than 4,000 illegal temples that didn't abide by the etiquette of the Great Li Empire were shut down. Moreover, these were only the temples located in the 62 nations to the south of the Yellow Court Nation, to the north of the Colorful Garment Nation, and above that Dragon Channel. Not only that, but this was with the officials of the Great Li Empire accepting benefits and being lenient with the illegal temples. Otherwise, this number could have easily doubled to over 8,000. Lakeview Academy was naturally happy to see these illegal temples shut down, so they still sent the assistant mountain master and several dozen noble scholars and virtuous scholars to assist the Great Li Empire even though they were otherwise unwilling to interact with the imperial court. These scholars inspected the situation and drew the boundaries for the imperial court of the Great Li Empire, and the Great Li Empire also gave Lakeview Academy a lot of face because of this. After rambling on and explaining all of these things, Cui Dongshan put down his teacup and looked around the room. He then smiled with squinted eyes and asked, "What's wrong? Sleeping early and waking early is good for the body. Are you people not aware of how to maintain good health? Perhaps you want to disturb Master and prevent him from resting early." Pei Qian was the first to run away. Each with different expressions, the 4 people from the picture scrolls also left one after another without saying a word. After everyone else left, Cui Dongshan stood up and bowed in respect before also taking his leave. Chen Ping'an needed to lock the door, so he walked to the entrance of his room with Cui Dongshan. With one person standing inside the room and one person standing outside, Chen Ping'an warned his disciple, "If you're hiding something from me and secretly interfering with the debate between Buddhism and Taoism in the Azure Phoenix Nation, then it's best that you tell me now. If it's necessary, I'll simply take a detour around the capital and wait for you at the Immortal Ferry Station located in the easternmost region. That way, we can at least avoid conflict between you and me and prevent you, Cui Dongshan, from betraying your master again." There was an upset expression on Cui Dongshan's face, as if he had just crapped his pants. "Master, you are such a magnanimous person, like the resplendent light that shines down after a bout of rain. When Master and I traveled to the Great Sui Nation back then, I felt like I was bathing in the refreshing spring wind the entire time. Why are you questioning my noble intentions as well?" He appeared extremely pained as he lamented, "I know, it's definitely the fault of your 4 subordinates. After interacting with them for too long, their crude and basic ways have inevitably rubbed off on Master to some slight degree. However, there's no need to worry. Starting from tomorrow I'll—" Chen Ping'an shut the door in his face and snapped, "Piss off." Though dressed in flowing white robes and appearing much like an otherworldly immortal, Cui Dongshan started to spin around as he made his way down the corridor. It could be said that he was rolling sideways. 2. Cui Dongshan stopped for a brief moment when passing Pei Qian's room next door, and he kindly warned the little girl as he spun around on the spot, "Pei Qian, since we're studying under the same master, let me tell you some good news. You definitely won't see the ghost hanging upside down with its tongue sticking out if you don't open your window, and you also won't see the female ghost who's married to the ghost king of an unmarked burial ground, wearing a bright red wedding dress, and lying next to your bed if you don't stick your head out of your blanket. If you don't become thirsty and climb out of bed to drink water at night, you definitely won't see the pale-faced ghost whose belly is stuffed full of water grass after drowning. Oh, that's right, some long-haired young girls who have died unjust deaths also like to curl up beside the feet of little girls. However, you don't need to be afraid of them. They look like nothing more than a large pile of hair no matter how you look at them." Pei Qian shivered in fear as she hid inside her blanket. At the same time, she furiously covered her ears to block out Cui Dongshan's words. While walking past the rooms of the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls, the continually spinning Cui Dongshan only chuckled and spoke outside Lu Baixiang's room, saying, "I heard Master mention that you're incredibly skilled at Go, so I've decided to learn how to play Go from you starting from tomorrow." Lu Baixiang was studying a Go manual in his room right now, and he smiled and replied, "Mr. Cui, if you don't mind, why don't you play a game of Go with me before going to rest?" Cui Dongshan had already disappeared down the corridor when he replied, "I'll pass for tonight. One needs to pick the right time and be in the right mood when learning something like Go." Outside the small inn, there stood 2 golden deities who were invisible to mortals. One stood to the left and one stood to the right. One was a scholarly deity and the other a martial deity. They had stern expressions, and it seemed as if they were 2 door gods guarding the inn. Dawn arrived and Chen Ping'an had just finished practicing the heaven and earth stance when someone knocked on his door. He walked over to open the door, and what greeted him was a listless and bleary-eyed little girl. By the looks of it, Cui Dongshan's kind-hearted warning last night had frightened Pei Qian quite a bit. Seeing this, Chen Ping'an told her to come inside to catch up on some sleep. Pei Qian felt immense relief, and she immediately lay down in bed and fell asleep. After tucking her in, Qian Ping'an sat down at the table and started to read the alchemy book given to him by Earth Immortal Lu Yong from the Green Goat Palace. Even though this book simply explained the process of pill refinement, it was still a secret scripture from a nascent tier Earth Immortal that contained many exquisite comprehensions of the Great Tao. Thus, Qian Ping'an would reap benefits from this book every time he settled down to read it with a clear mind. It could be said that opening this book was sure to benefit him. The inn was quite basic, with not a single meal provided. Guests would need to leave the inn to look for food themselves. The innkeeper and the workers were also very short-tempered, and Qian Ping'an and his companions had seen them arguing with a group of merchants upon first arriving here. Both sides clearly detested the other. However, Qian Ping'an had Cui Dongshan, Lu Baixiang, and Sui Yubian to support him, and it was clear that the inn would treat guests differently depending on what said guests looked like. They were much more hospitable to Qian Ping'an and his companions, and they actively recommended a few local delicacies for them to try. When Pei Qian woke up, Qian Ping'an brought her out to eat breakfast. After they finished eating, they purchased a few other portions to bring back to the inn. Qian Ping'an didn't return to his room, and he told Pei Qian to bring the food to Cui Dongshan and the others. He also told her to inform them that they would be staying in the county city for 2 more days. He was going to wander around for a bit. Pei Qian was delighted to hear that they were going to rest for 2 days. Not needing to travel meant that she didn't need to practice the dry and uninteresting 6-step walking meditation. This was simply amazing. While Qian Ping'an was wandering around the county city by himself, Cui Dongshan, Wei Xian, and the others accepted the food from Pei Qian and gathered together to eat breakfast. Cui Dongshan was filled with gratitude, and he claimed that his master was looking out for his disciple. Where else could someone find a master as thoughtful and well-intentioned as Qian Ping'an? Pei Qian didn't dare to retort, so she could only grumble in her mind. Looking out for him? What a joke. It was clear that Qian Ping'an didn't trust Cui Dongshan. Cui Dongshan was in a sparkling mood after breakfast, and he smiled at Pei Qian and asked, "Do you know how to play 5 in a row? Small gambles can bring entertainment, so why don't we gamble 1 copper coin per match?" The go pieces would make increasingly loud cracking sounds as they were placed on the go board, and it was as if Pei Qian and Wei Xian wanted to smash a hole into the board. Lu Baixiang would feel immense regret whenever he saw this. Pei Qian won more games than she lost against Wei Xian, who was a very terrible go player. She also liked to goad him when she was winning, yet she would immediately try to retract her moves when she was losing. Fortunately, Wei Xian wasn't too concerned about winning or game etiquette. Upon hearing Cui Dongshan suggest that they gamble, Pei Qian immediately shook her head in earnest. She wasn't stupid. Even though Cui Dongshan had asked to learn Go from Lu Baixiang, 5 in a row was a simple game with no barrier to entry to speak of. Thus, Pei Qian wasn't confident that she could beat Cui Dongshan. After all, few people in the world would be as stubborn and idiotic as Old Man Wei. Cui Dongshan chuckled and suggested, "As fellow disciples of Qian Ping'an, we naturally can't spoil the relationship between us for a small board game. How about this? Whoever loses the game wins the copper coin." Pei Qian's eyes immediately lit up. Winning a copper coin for each game that she lost? There existed such an amazing deal in the world? And thus, Lu Baixiang brought his go set to Pei Qian's room, after which the 2 fellow disciples who were yet to figure out the seniority between them started to play a terrible game of 5 in a row. In fact, it could be said that they were desecrating the go set. As if in tacit understanding, the 4 martial artists stood together to observe the battle between Pei Qian and Cui Dongshan. Pei Qian was placing pieces randomly, with each piece being placed as far from the others as possible. Cui Dongshan was no different, and his placement of pieces also appeared completely random. He would sometimes place his pieces beside Pei Qian's pieces, and he would sometimes place his pieces in the north, south, east, and west, respectively. He started to utilize some elementary go formations, and it looked like Pei Qian was more likely to lose than him. However, as the go board filled up and reduced the amount of available space for them to play with, Pei Qian was astonished and pained to discover that it was becoming easier and easier for her to achieve 5 in a row. When the go board eventually became filled with crisscrossing black and white pieces, Pei Qian was shocked to discover that she had actually won. She would achieve 5 in a row no matter where she placed her pieces. After frustratingly losing a copper coin, Pei Qian felt such immense regret that she felt a strong urge to eat the entire go board. That way she could retract all of her moves. However, she didn't dare to cheat after she stole a glance at Cui Dongshan, who was sitting there and snacking on roasted seeds. Cui Dongshan shot a sideways glance at the Go board and sighed in sympathy. It looks like I've lost by a single move. It seems like my gambling fortune is slightly better than yours. How about we play another game? If you feel like a single Go board is not enough for you to display your full skills, then we can add another 1, 2, or even 3 Go boards. But we'll need to increase the wager by 1 copper coin for each additional Go board. I'll immediately pay up once I win a game. You can continue to play and add as many Go boards as you want until you lose and win money. This is quite fair, isn't it? Pei Qian hesitated and said, but we can't fit 2 Go boards on the table. Cui Dongshan pointed at the floor and replied, then we can play on the floor. What is there to be afraid of? If there are too many Go boards, then we can even play in the corridor outside the room, right? In any case, the more Go boards there are, the more copper coins you can win. My memory is SOSO, but I know that your memory is very good. We can ask Lu Baixiang or Sui Yubian to borrow 2 pieces of charcoal from the inn, and I'll use them to draw up some Go boards for us to use. We'll rely on our memory instead of using actual Go pieces, and it will count as my loss if I remember anything wrong. Pei Qian turned around and glanced at Old Man Wei. Wei Xian most likely felt like pursuing defeat instead of victory was far too brain-dead, so he directly turned around and walked away. Zhu Lian rolled his eyes and left the room. In the end, it was surprisingly the 2 Go masters from the Lotus Flower Blessed Land who remained. Sure enough, Lu Baixiang left to borrow some charcoal from the inn. Meanwhile, Sui Yubian stood beside Pei Qian and Cui Dongshan with an apathetic expression. It was quite unexpected that the 2 of them were patient enough to stay here and watch the 2 disciples of Chen Ping'an squatting on the floor and mucking around with each other. Chen Ping'an and the 4 martial artists from the Lotus Flower Blessed Land were well aware of just how good Pei Qian's memory was. In fact, it could be said that her memory was outstanding. This was an innate talent of the little girl, and Chen Ping'an had to concede that he was inferior. Even Lu Baixiang, who was extremely skilled at playing Go and reviewing finished games of Go, had to admit that he was no match for Pei Qian in terms of memory. Thus, after using 2 entire boxes of Go pieces, Pei Qian and Cui Dongshan were not only competing to see who was more shameless, they were also competing to see who had a better memory. There were already 2 additional Go boards drawn on the floor using a piece of charcoal, yet Pei Qian would still achieve 5 in a row and defeat Cui Dongshan if she didn't add an additional Go board. Thus, she had no option but to ask Cui Dongshan to draw another Go board. Lu Baixiang quietly left the room, and Sui Yubian departed soon after him. Standing in the corridor, Sui Yubian asked, were you able to determine his skill level? Lu Baixiang shook his head and replied, 5 in a row is too simple, so Pei Qian won't be able to draw out this person's true skill even if she adds another 10 Go boards. If you don't hold back and play with your full strength, how great would the difference between us be? Sui Yubian asked. Lu Baixiang smiled and replied, to be very honest, you might not be skilled enough to make me use my clever plays. So-called clever plays were skillful moves on the Go board, used when both sides evenly matched, or when one side wanted to salvage a seemingly unfavorable situation. Skillful moves would be used to seize the initiative and capture pieces. Lu Baixiang was hinting at the fact that he only needed to play normally, as if he were a tiler methodically placing pieces. Playing calmly would allow him to comfortably defeat Sui Yubian. Sui Yubian didn't feel offended or angry. The difference in their skill level was laid bare on the Go board, and she had frequently played against Lu Baixiang during their long trip. During these games, Sui Yubian would either push aside the Go board or place 2 pieces in the lower right corner to admit defeat. Almost no Go masters in the world would utter the words "I admit defeat." However, pushing the Go board aside or placing 2 pieces in the lower right corner of the board were both silent ways of admitting defeat. Even though Sui Yubian was extremely competitive, she had always viewed Go as nothing more than a small pastime. Victory or defeat in Go wouldn't affect her much more important sword Dao. She wouldn't be a sore loser about it. Moreover, according to the Go world of the future generations that Zhu Lian had once mentioned, the Go masters of the various nations in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land felt immense respect and admiration for the skills of Lu Baixiang. Of course, the Go masters of each nation, each generation, and each faction would still have conflicting opinions when it came to choosing the best Go player in history. But if they were to choose the top 3, Liu Baixiang would invariably occupy one of the positions. This was a reflection of Liu Baixiang's incredible skills and reputation in the Go world. As for the two other people, one was Go Saint Wang Jiyuan, and one was Huang, someone who was later confirmed to be an otherworldly immortal. At the same time, Huang was also the clan rejuvenation ancestor of the Pine Song Nation's Lake Mountain faction. In other words, he was Yu Zhenyi's senior. It was this person who had borrowed the huge influence and reputation of his sect, as well as his peerless Go skills, to abolish the initial position system. 1. This was a watershed moment in the Go world of the Lotus Flower-blessed land, and it had led to the creation of the ancient Go faction and the new Go faction. Wang Jiyuan was born 60 years after Huang, and Huang had gone missing while in his 70s. Thus, the two Go masters never had the opportunity to play against each other. Regarding the three Go masters from different generations, the grandmasters of future generations argued incessantly about who possessed more profound skills. Liu Baixiang was undoubtedly the pinnacle of the ancient Go style, while Wang Jiyuan was recognized as the pinnacle of the new Go style. In fact, Wang Jiyuan was also profoundly skilled at all kinds of set formations, so many people were convinced that he could definitely start with a handicap of 2 moves if he played against Liu Baixiang. In their opinion, Liu Baixiang didn't have the right to enjoy an equal standing with Wang Jiyuan. However, Go masters who had carefully studied the ancient Go manuals claimed that Liu Baixiang could easily defeat Wang Jiyuan if he were given 2 or 3 months to familiarize himself with the new Go style. He could easily gain himself a new disciple and have Wang Jiyuan bow in submission. There were many spirited debates, and everyone held their own opinions. However, no Go master as skilled as these 3 people appeared among the future generations, and no one was able to offer a convincing argument about who was the most profoundly skilled of the 3 people either. Thus, this was destined to remain an unsolved mystery that everyone continued to argue about. "Don't lose to that person," Sui Yubian suddenly said. Liu Baixiang smiled faintly and replied, "We'll wait and see." Inside Pei Qian's room, Cui Dongshan was squatting on the floor and snacking on roasted seeds. Meanwhile, Pei Qian was puckering her face and on the verge of tears. She was about to lose 6 copper coins. Cui Dongshan consoled Pei Qian and said, "We still have enough charcoal, and victory is far from determined. How about we draw another Go board? You can gamble big and win big." Pei Qian raised an arm and wiped the tears from her eyes. She then retrieved the scented pouch which Aunt Gue had given her from her sleeve. She was using this scented pouch as a money pouch now, and she reached inside and grabbed 7 copper coins from it. These were copper coins that she had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. Pei Qian gripped the copper coins tightly and appeared extremely hesitant as she stood up and lightly placed them on the table. She looked at Cui Dongshan with a pitiful expression, hoping that he could display his generosity as an immortal and leave without taking her money. Unexpectedly, however, Cui Dongshan chuckled and walked over to the table, grabbing all of the copper coins before turning around to leave. Before walking out of Pei Qian's room, Cui Dongshan didn't forget to look back and say with a smile, "Remember to return the Go set to Liu Baixiang. Also, don't forget to wipe the Go boards from the floor. Otherwise, Chen Ping'an will definitely scold me severely if he learns that we gambled with each other. He'll also make you copy texts until your arm falls off. As for these copper coins, you should be gracious in defeat and accept this loss. Chen Ping'an certainly won't help you get them back." Cui Dongshan wrapped his hands behind his head and swaggered out of Pei Qian's room, continuing, "Today is such a nice day. After making some money, it's time to head out to buy a stick of Tonghulu." Pei Qian stood beside the table and cried pitifully. Cui Dongshan suddenly walked in reverse and leaned backward, sticking his head inside Pei Qian's room and saying with a smile, "Pei Qian, I'm going to learn how to play Go from Liu Baixiang, aren't I? I want to give myself some good fortune, so why don't you call me Go Immortal? I'll give you a copper coin every time you call me Go Immortal." After 2 hours, Pei Qian had not only returned the Go set to Liu Baixiang, but she had also called Cui Dongshan Go Immortal so many times that she had already lost her voice. The 2 of them returned to Pei Qian's room, and the little girl squeaked and groaned but was unable to say another word. Thus, she smiled widely and extended her hand to Cui Dongshan, asking for her payment. Seeing no response from him, she hurriedly ran over to the table to write down a number. Cui Dongshan smiled faintly and said, "I was only messing around with you. Did you really believe me?" Pei Qian suffered a mental breakdown. However, she couldn't speak right now, so she could only bare her teeth and wave her arms. Cui Dongshan narrowed his eyes and pretended to poke Pei Qian's eyes, saying in a threatening voice, "If you continue to annoy me, then you won't just be a mute little girl. You'll also become a blind little girl." No matter how angry Master becomes, he can't possibly beat his disciple to death, can he? However, things will be quite miserable for you. What can you look forward to once you become blind? Do you get me? Cui Dongshan stood up and stumbled around, pretending to be blind. Pei Qian had an extremely dark expression. She pursed her lips, yet she didn't dare to raise her hiking pole to smack this bastard to death. She felt an increasing sense of despair, and her expression became blank as she plopped down on the side of her bed. Her heart was as dead as ashes and her tears fell like rain. Cui Dongshan suddenly took out something that looked like a silver ingot from his sleeve and lightly tossed it to Pei Qian, saying, "Seeing that you're quite tactful, I'll let you play with this for a few days. If everything goes smoothly with me learning Go, I might even be in such a good mood that I'll just let you keep it. But remember to return it to me first when I play Go with Liu Baixiang." A smile quickly broke through Pei Qian's tears as she held the hefty silver ingot. Cui Dongshan left her room again. Pei Qian placed the large silver ingot on her table, and she didn't get tired of it no matter how she looked at it. She was just mulling over how she could keep this silver ingot, yet her eyes suddenly widened in shock when she saw the so-called silver ingot start to squirm around and eventually transform into a snow-white grasshopper that hopped outside the window, disappearing in a flash. When Pei Qian returned to her senses, she immediately climbed through the window and jumped outside, desperately searching around the courtyard for the so-called silver ingot. She searched through the overgrown underbrushes, the foot of the walls, and the cracks between rocks for more than an hour, and she even started to dig the ground using her hands in the end. Even so, Pei Qian still failed to find the silver ingot that had suddenly transformed into an insect. Completely exhausted, Pei Qian dazedly sat on the ground with a blank expression. She didn't even have the energy to cry this time. When Chan Ping'an finished wandering around the scholarly temple and returned to the inn, he saw Pei Qian's skinny and dejected figure sitting on the ground. He called her a few times, yet he didn't receive any response. Chan Ping'an had no option but to climb through the window and jump outside. Pei Qian's actions were stiff as she turned her head around, and she immediately hung her head and gripped the hem of her clothes when she saw that it was Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an sighed and returned to his room before directly heading over to look for Cui Dongshan. He quickly walked over to the window again, shouting to Pei Qian, "Regarding the 7 copper coins, you can win them back if you're capable enough. If you can't, then just admit defeat and accept your loss. You're allowed to play with the bug silver for a few days, but you have to return it to him whenever he wants it back." Even though Pei Qian was still extremely sad, she still hurriedly stood up and climbed through the window, jumping onto the floor and extending both hands to carefully accept the bug silver that had returned to the shape of a silver ingot. Chan Ping'an immediately grabbed Pei Qian's ear and dragged her over to the tableside, scolding, "You're quite impressive now, aren't you? You even know how to gamble with other people, huh?" Pei Qian trembled in apprehension as she stood beside the table. However, she was still tightly gripping the bug silver. "If you like to gamble so much, then why don't we grab your treasure box from the bamboo bookcase?" Chan Ping'an asked. "You're quite wealthy now anyway, so you can still gamble with Cui Dongshan a lot of times. Should I take it out for you? Or are you going to do it yourself?" Pei Qian shook her head vigorously, a flustered expression on her face. Chan Ping'an smacked the table and instructed, "Go and grab your treasure box. You can carry it yourself in the future." Pei Qian furiously turned around and put on a defiant expression, not crying nor begging for mercy. She didn't look at Chan Ping'an, and she didn't listen to his instructions either. Chan Ping'an was even more enraged upon seeing this. Pei Qian gritted her teeth and forcefully threw the silver ingot outside. Chan Ping'an stood up and went next door to open his bamboo bookcase, retrieving Pei Qian's treasure box before returning to her room and tossing it on her table. He then walked back to his own room again. Unexpectedly, Chan Ping'an had just drunk a single sip of medicinal wine when Pei Qian sprinted inside like a bolt of lightning, quickly stuffing her treasure box inside his bamboo bookcase before he could even react. She then ran away as quickly as she had arrived. Chan Ping'an once again took the treasure box and walked next door. However, he was surprised to discover that Pei Qian had locked her door. He was furious, and he felt a strong urge to kick open Pei Qian's door before tossing both her and her treasure box outside the inn. He stood outside her door for a brief moment. Inside the locked room, Pei Qian was leaning against the door with her back, as if to prop the door shut with all her might. At the same time, she raised her skinny arms and used the back of her hands to cover her small and tanned face. On the roof of the inn, the young boy in white, the main culprit behind all this, was lying face up and resting his head on his arms, with a hint of a smile on his face. Lu Baixiang was completely focused as he studied Go manuals in his room. Right now he was studying various Go manuals derived from the so-called 10 games in the iridescent clouds, something that was incredibly famous in the majestic world. Some people especially dissected the iridescent cloud setups, while some people focused on examining the exquisite moves made in the 10 games. It was said that these Go manuals had given birth to many Go experts in the cultivation world. In terms of playing Go alone, Lu Baixiang had been peerless in the lotus flower-blessed land. Upon first arriving in the majestic world, he had naturally been very conceited and held his own Go skills in incredibly high regard. After obtaining this Go manual by chance, however, he finally realized why people said that there was always a higher heaven and there was always a more capable person. The more Lu Baixiang studied these Go manuals, the more he came to understand the profound skills of the two Go players. Disregarding the city lord of White Emperor City who would respectfully allow the world to go first, and simply focusing on the esteemed person who had the right to play Go with the demonic paragon amid the iridescent clouds, one could see that each of his moves to set up his formations was absolutely spectacular. Ignoring the city lord's trump cards, the esteemed person's moves were simply stunning, even though he had lost many times to the city lord. In fact, his moves were so incredible that people from future generations would feel as if bursts of wind and lightning were surging out from the pages of the Go manuals and yearning to stifle and engulf them. Because of this, Lu Baixiang had searched long and hard to collect most of the Go manuals pertaining to this esteemed person's games. In the end, Lu Baixiang had reached the conclusion that this esteemed person's Go skills were without blemish and closely aligned with the Tao. Indeed, most Go masters in the majestic world regarded this esteemed person very highly, with many of them holding the same three opinions. Firstly, this person would sacrifice a small region in order to gain an overall advantage, a style that went against the common wisdom of capturing the various important corners. Secondly, even though this person would occasionally play in a highly offensive manner and carve out a sanguinary path, he would largely play in a calm, exquisite, yet profound manner. Thirdly, this person had invented the avalanche formation and many other remarkable formations. Even though many of these formations had already been analyzed and understood by Go masters of future generations, with some of them being directly understood and countered by the city lord of White Emperor City during their 10 games in the iridescent clouds, those studying the Go manuals would still invariably be astonished and deeply impressed by this person's creativity. It seemed as if this person were playing a completely different game of Go compared to everyone else. In Lu Baixiang's opinion, this esteemed person was incredibly unfortunate to have been born in the same generation as the city lord of White Emperor City, a freakish Go talent with no precedent in the past and no rival in the future. He suffered many losses to the city lord because the latter had already attained the great Tao. Lu Baixiang studied the Go manual again and again, and he felt like he could only describe the notorious Confucian scholars' moves as never incorrect and never thoughtless. Lu Baixiang had once smiled and told Chen Ping'an that his biggest wish was to visit White Emperor City. In the depths of Lu Baixiang's heart, however, the city lord of White Emperor City wasn't the person whom he wanted to play against the most. Instead, it was Mr. Cui, the imperial preceptor who had once been the scholarly sage's first disciple. Lu Baixiang put down the Go manual and sighed. He could most likely visit White Emperor City. This would only be a matter of time. As for playing 10 games of Go with Cui Chan, however, there was little chance that he could achieve this dream. Even though Cui Chan was the imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire, Chen Ping'an's hometown, observing his style of play was enough to tell Lu Baixiang that this person was an extremely haughty individual. He most likely wouldn't be qualified to play Go with Cui Chan even if he managed to meet him. In other words, Lu Baixiang was well aware that he was still insufficiently skilled at Go. However, Cui Chan's actions had caused his reputation to plummet, especially in the Parasol Leaf continent and the Eastern Treasured Vial continent. Thus, many people purposely underplayed his skills in Go. Lu Baixiang felt a great yearning toward 3 bold remarks that Cui Chan had once made. It doesn't matter how one sets up in the beginning. The endgame is simply a process of sweeping the battlefield. Whoever claims to be peerless in the endgame is simply making an utter fool of themselves. Those playing black should learn from Ma Lei, those playing white should learn from me, Cui Chan, and those playing with a handicap should learn from the City Lord of White Emperor City. One can learn 70 to 80% of Ma Lei's strategies, and one can learn 50 to 60% of my strategies. As for the strategies of the City Lord of White Emperor City, learning them will do you no good at all. Lu Baixiang took a deep breath and shot a glance at the Go board sitting on the table in front of him. He was just about to stand up and look for Cui Dongshan, and he presumed that playing the best of 3 games would allow him to understand this person's skill level in Go. When Lu Baixiang walked out of his room, he noticed Wei Xian walking over with a strange expression. Lu Baixiang turned out of the corridor and arrived at a location slightly further away before stopping and knocking on a door. Standing at the intersection, Wei Xian looked over and asked, "Are you looking for Cui Dongshan?" Lu Baixiang nodded in response. Wei Xian shook his hand and said, "There's no need to look for him. He's made a bet with Julien as well, and he's already left the county city now. Sui Yubian also left with them." "What did they bet on?" Lu Baixiang asked in puzzlement. Cui Dongshan said that he wanted to spar with Julien, and if Julien wins, then he'll give him a minimization treasure. If Julien loses, however, then he'll need to prepare a midnight snack for Cui Dongshan every day, Wei Xian replied. Lu Baixiang chuckled and said in amusement, "Julien actually agreed to this?" Wei Xian hesitated for a moment before scratching his head and explaining, "Obviously not. After all, Pei Qian was tricked by Cui Dongshan and screwed over pretty badly, so Julien was understandably afraid that he would be next to bite the dust. Cui Dongshan said that he could stand in one spot and not move, yet Julien was still unwilling to agree to his proposal. Cui Dongshan then said that he could stand there and not move his arms or legs either, and Julien asked him whether he was an earth immortal or a sword cultivator. Cui Dongshan replied that he definitely wasn't a sword cultivator. After hearing this, Julien finally agreed to his proposal. Sui Yubian also went over to watch them spar. 1 short hour later, Cui Dongshan was all smiles as he returned to the inn. Walking behind him, Sui Yubian had a strange expression while Julien appeared ashen-faced. Julien directly returned to his room, slamming his door shut with a loud bang. Lu Baixiang was quietly sitting in his own room and didn't ask any questions. Sui Yubian walked inside and sat opposite him, saying, "Cui Dongshan said that he's about to come over to learn Go from you." Lu Baixiang smiled and asked, "How did Julien lose? Didn't he secretly advance to the 8th tier not long ago?" There was a slightly helpless expression on Sui Yubian's face as she replied, "That person genuinely didn't move a single muscle. But he had quite a number of immortal treasures. From beginning to end, Julien was unable to make it within 30 meters of him. It was as if Cui Dongshan were toying around with a dog. In fact, I wouldn't fare any better than Julien if I were to face this person." Lu Baixiang poured a cup of tea for Sui Yubian. Yet the stunningly beautiful woman didn't accept it. She shook her head and said, "I won't watch the 2 of you playing Go." Lu Baixiang chuckled and asked, "What's wrong? You don't fancy my chances of winning?" Sui Yubian stood up and replied, "I don't feel like he's very skilled at Go. But I do feel one thing. Whatever bet he makes, he is sure to win it." During Julien's sparring session with Cui Dongshan, the latter had simply stood there and controlled his myriad of immortal treasures, completely suppressing Julien and making him unable to raise his head. Not only that, but he had even encouraged Julien and cheered him on the entire time. In the end, an expression of disappointment had spread across Cui Dongshan's face, and he had said that Julien was truly a useless ant and only worthy of being a cook for his master. Afterward, Cui Dongshan's words had almost caused Sui Yubian to draw her sword. He had shot a sideways glance at her and claimed that she was slightly better than Julien. She was very beautiful after all, so his master would perhaps face the right side when he slept every night. 1. Lu Baixiang fell deep into thought. After Sui Yubian left, he habitually started to read that Go manual again. After a short while, the young boy in white swaggered into his room, snacking on roasted seeds as he did so. He didn't sit down after entering, and he faltered when he saw the Go manual that Lu Baixiang had just put down on the table. He was slightly dazed as he asked, "This is what you're reading? The concept of life and death, the essential pieces, formation setups, and game principles. Is there something wrong with this?" Lu Baixiang countered. Cui Dongshan heaved a sigh and sat down opposite Lu Baixiang. There was a troubled expression on his face as he announced, "Forget about it, I won't learn Go from you anymore." Lu Baixiang frowned deeply, and he pinched a Go stone between his fingers and asked, "And why is that?" Cui Dongshan was holding the roasted seeds that he had tricked Pei Qian for in his left hand. With his right index finger, he casually pointed at Lu Baixiang. "You," he pointed at himself with his thumb, "should probably learn Go from me instead." Lu Baixiang stood up and smiled as he looked at the handsome young boy with a red birthmark on his glabella. He gestured for Cui Dongshan to sit, and he replied, "In reality, it's not important who's learning Go from whom." As one of the best Go grandmasters from the Lotus Flower-blessed land, Lu Baixiang had a feeling that he might play his best ever Go game today. Cui Dongshan sat down with one foot resting on the chair, and he even bent down to rest his chin on his knee. His posture was in stark contrast to Lu Baixiang, who was sitting in an upright manner. Cui Dongshan extended an arm and gently ran his finger along the side of the Go box, asking in a lazy voice, "You haven't determined your rank yet, have you?" Lu Baixiang couldn't help but chuckle. He hadn't imagined that a day would come when someone belittled his skills as a Go player. However, his mental state wouldn't be affected by something as trivial as this. He nodded and replied with a smile, "I've only just arrived here, so I indeed haven't determined my rank yet." Cui Dongshan nodded and explained, "According to the rules of the mortal world, one can first play 3 games with a 9th rank Go official. During these 3 games, the Go official will have a handicap of 3 moves, 2 moves, and 1 move respectively. Of course, victory or defeat won't affect the final appraisal. Rather, this is more an act of guidance and benevolence. Lu Baixiang, your fortune is far greater than your skill in Go." What truly determined a new player's Go rank was naturally their games against 4th or 5th rank players. Cui Dongshan suddenly looked up and said, "You might feel like you can play your best ever Go game in a moment. However, let me tell you right now that this is a mistaken feeling. I know that you won't accept this fact, so let me reverse the order and start with a handicap of 1 move first. I'll then start with a handicap of 2 and 3 moves afterward. That way, you'll gain a clear understanding of your own level. What do you say? As for whether we start with an empty board or pre-placed pieces, the choice is all yours." Lu Baixiang shook his head and said, "There's no need for you to start with a handicap. Even if I lose, I'll still be aware of the skill difference between us." Lu Baixiang smiled and asked, "How many compensation points should we give White?" Cui Dongshan retracted his smile and replied in impatience, "We'll decide that later." Lu Baixiang went along with Cui Dongshan, and the Go box beside him coincidentally held the black pieces. Thus he grabbed a piece and went first. Cui Dongshan allowed Lu Baixiang to set up a renowned formation from the iridescent cloud Go manual. Black 1, 3, and 5 took the corners, while Black 7 defended a corner and Black 9 formed a diagonal. This was an impenetrable formation that also carried a subtle killing intent. It was as if roaring wind and lashing rain were about to descend at any moment. Cui Dongshan was unfazed, and played in a very normal manner. In fact, he didn't use a single one of those techniques that future generations would regard as never incorrect. Lu Baixiang was like a meditating old monk, completely forgetting his sense of self as he immersed himself in the Go board. Sitting opposite him, Cui Dongshan was the complete opposite, a real chatterbox. Not only was he playing in a casual manner, but it genuinely looked like he was teaching Lu Baixiang how to play Go. In reality, starting with pre-placed pieces is more fun. The current trend of starting with an empty board obviously has its benefits as well, in the sense that it can make the Go board feel larger. However, if a person isn't skilled enough, they'll use up all of the impressive set formations in the early game. They'll appear to be in a strong position with much territory, yet the middle game will completely expose them and lead them to make incorrect move after incorrect move. It's completely unwatchable, akin to watching an old farmer collect feces from the cesspit, wild dogs randomly biting people, and someone catching loaches from the foul-smelling gutters. That is utterly boring. It's something that will put spectators to sleep. When commenting on the initial position system of ancient times, people like to downplay the importance of the early game. They state that things will only become interesting starting from the middle game when both sides begin to fight for territory. In reality, this is still incorrect to some degree. Lu Baixiang, your intuition is quite good when it comes to the shape of the Go board. But it's only quite good and nothing else. As for your understanding of Go principles, it's like Sui Yubian's undergarment. To say nothing of touching it, you've never even seen it before, no? They were just starting to enter the middle game, and the rambling Cui Dongshan had already used his hand to cover his Go box. Lu Baixiang looked up and asked, "What are you doing, Mr. Cui?" Cui Dongshan faltered and replied, "Can you not tell that you've already lost? It will only take another 30 moves at most." Then he raised his hand and said, "Well, all right, then let's continue." Lu Baixiang frowned and continued to play pieces. One had to admit that Lu Baixiang appeared extremely elegant and outstanding while he was playing Go. Whether he was pinching pieces with his fingers, leaning over to play pieces, or sitting upright to observe the Go board, he appeared extremely impressive and refined the entire time. However, it was a shame that Cui Dongshan didn't care about this at all. In fact, Cui Dongshan barely seemed to care about the game that they were playing. He made his moves very quickly, and he would wait for Lu Baixiang in boredom after allowing his white pieces to take root on the Go board. In fact, this was probably the main reason behind his rambling. He was far too bored from waiting, so he needed to find something to occupy himself with. Truth be told, there's not really a notion of advantage or disadvantage when it comes to starting with pre-placed pieces or an empty board. Many Go players are debating this point right now, and to be very blunt, this is due to their shallow and narrow understanding of Go. Moreover, there was actually meant to be an 11th game in addition to the 10 games in the iridescent clouds. As for the Go board, it wouldn't have been an ordinary Go board of 19 by 19. That would have been far too small. Lu Baixiang tensed up, and he paused for a long while before silently examining the state of the Go game, which wasn't too complicated. His opponent hadn't used profoundly powerful offensive techniques, nor had he used smart exchanges or so-called demon saber techniques. It was as if Cui Dongshan had calmly and casually played half a game of Go with Lu Baixiang, patiently waiting for him to concede the entire time. Heavy emotions weighed on Lu Baixiang's mind as he placed 2 pieces on the lower right corner of the board. Cui Dongshan yawned and said, "Now that's more like it. What did I tell you before? There's no need to consider compensation points for white. Next up, should I start with a handicap of 1 move? Mr. Cui, how about you start with a handicap of 2 points? Lu Baixiang suggested in a solemn voice. Cui Dongshan laughed and remarked, "He who understands the situation is a wise man. Not bad, not bad. This is worthy of me providing you with guidance for a game." Lu Baixiang smiled bitterly and remained silent. After calming down his mind, he started to clear the Go board. Upon completing this, he took a deep breath and started to play the second game. Just like before, it was clear that Cui Dongshan wasn't playing at his full strength. Very early on in the game, he said, "None of my moves are incorrect, so I'll naturally achieve a flawless victory." After reaching the middle game, Lu Baixiang often needed to think for a long time before making a move. Cui Dongshan didn't urge him to hurry up, but he would frequently look around and appear completely distracted. After playing another piece, Lu Baixiang surprisingly took the initiative and asked, "You're simply playing without being incorrect and nothing more?" That's all," Cui Dongshan replied. "However, my so-called act of not being incorrect isn't a notion for ordinary 9th rank Go masters. You won't understand this. This is a profound concept that's worlds beyond the mortal realm. That being the case, how can I possibly teach it to an elementary student?" Lu Baixiang managed to drag this game out to the endgame stages. However, he was still forced to place 2 pieces in the lower right corner and admit defeat. Cui Dongshan's aura suddenly changed, and he appeared slightly excited as he suggested with a smile, "Why don't we add a small bonus to the 3rd round?" "What small bonus?" Lu Baixiang asked. "Master told me that the 4 of you were each told 1 sentence when you left your original world," Cui Dongshan replied with a smile. "I'm roughly aware of what they are already, but I also know that some of you definitely lied about it. It wasn't necessarily a complete lie, more like a half-truth. Logically speaking, you Lu Baixiang are the most suspicious of the four people, especially since your sentence was the most useless. But these things aren't important. If I win the third round, you simply need to tell me who you suspect of lying the most. You can say anyone you want as long as you give me a name. Lu Baixiang didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. If that's the case, then is there any point at all? Of course, Cui Dongshan replied with a serious expression. Lu Baixiang pondered for a moment before shaking his head and saying, 2 games are enough. Cui Dongshan's face was a picture of disappointment as he said, your Go skills are good enough for you to become a strong 9th rank player in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Even though this is only equivalent to ordinary 9th rank players in the Middle-earth Divine Continent, it's already quite a decent rank. If you learn a few more moves and study a few more Go manuals, you might even be able to make a name for yourself in the Go world of the Middle-earth Divine Continent, a place that's filled with countless grandmasters. You're not going to play even if I start with a handicap of 3 moves. Lu Baixiang hesitated for a moment before asking in curiosity, Mr. Cui, can your Go skills rank among the top 10 in the majestic world? Cui Dongshan rolled his eyes and replied, Go is only a minor Dao, so what does it matter even if I am one of the top 10? Some upper 5-tier cultivators from the School of Naturalists and the School of Foretellers are incredibly skilled at Go. But so what? Aren't they still beaten to a pulp by other cultivators at the same cultivation base? There was a fervent look in Lu Baixiang's eyes as he asked, Dare I ask, Mr. Cui, how great is the skill difference between you and the city lord of White Emperor City? Cui Dongshan pondered for a moment before replying, There's a Malay playing black between us. Lu Baixiang gradually calmed down and he smiled and asked, If you lose to me while playing with a handicap of 3 moves, then what will the consequence be? Cui Dongshan pointed at the iridescent cloud Go manual and replied, Then I'll eat this book. Lu Baixiang simply dismissed this as a joke. He couldn't help but ask, Then how great is the skill difference between you and Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan of the Great Li Empire? Cui Dongshan shot a glance at Lu Baixiang and didn't say anything. Sorry for being disrespectful, Lu Baixiang said in apology. Cui Dongshan stood up and asked, How do you feel after losing 2 games? Lu Baixiang also stood up and he replied in sincerity, I learned a lot, and I feel a sense of glory even though I lost. Cui Dongshan bobbed his head around and said with a dismissive expression, Do you have the right to utter that final phrase? Looking at the departing Cui Dongshan, Lu Baixiang sat back down and started to review the games by himself. As he walked through the corridor, Cui Dongshan murmured to himself, Wei Xian is quite a dangerous individual. However, he immediately chuckled in self-ridicule and added, Even so, what does this matter? He suddenly broke into laughter and knocked on Sui Yubian's door, asking, Big Sister Sui, are you inside? I've already finished learning Go from Lu Baixiang. So why don't I learn sword techniques from you as well?